our protagonist wakes up completely lost. He finds himself standing in the middle of a hospital hallway, wondering what's going on. Suddenly, a doctor yells to crank up the oxygen to maximum. Then he tells the interns not to stop compressions on the patient. At that, one of the interns starts doing chest compressions, and he was doing it with all his might. Meanwhile, our protagonist just watches the whole scene from a distance. He then notices something odd about that intern, and he feels like this scene is weirdly familiar. That's when it hits him, and he's completely floored by the discovery. The person doing the chest compressions was none other than himself, back when he was an intern. The doctor, seeing it wasn't working, orders them to charge the defibrillator to 200 joules. Right after, they press the paddles to the patient's chest to try and revive him with the shock. However, it seems the heart rhythm isn't coming back, and finally the heart stops for good. Our protagonist is still in shock as he relives this memory. A tense atmosphere starts to fill the entire room, and facing the situation, the head doctor makes a tough call. He orders everyone to stop resuscitation efforts. He then looks at his watch and officially declares the time of passing of patient Kim Jung-soo, and the time he passed was recorded at 3:22 in the morning, and our protagonist just watches the whole scene, powerless to do anything. Right after, the doctor covers the deceased's face with a white sheet. Suddenly, something strange starts to happen, and time and space begin to warp, and all of a sudden, our protagonist wakes up on a crowded train. Meanwhile, the subway peacefully continues on its way along the city tracks. Embarrassed, the protagonist wonders if it was all just a simple nightmare during a nap. But he quickly pulls himself together and tells himself he needs to focus, because it's going to be a tough day at work. With that, our protagonist reaches into his jacket, and then pulls out his ID badge. On it are his name, Shin Seon-han, and his position as a doctor at Yongguk University Hospital. From there, he remembers that ever since he was young, he'd always been exceptionally good with knives. In his memory, his parents come home with groceries and call out for him. His mother finds him in the kitchen and asks what he's doing. At that moment, he turns around with a smile, holding a knife and covered in a red liquid. His parents panic, and his mother quickly snatches the knife from his hand, but when they look at kitchen counter, they're completely stunned. The boy had actually filleted a stonefish with stunning perfection. Seeing this, his father declared him a prodigy and decided he would inherit the family's sashimi restaurant. So, the protagonist grew up naturally thinking he would take over the Shin family restaurant. However, someone he saw by chance completely changed his destiny. On a television show, Korea's greatest genius surgeon, Professor Bakyu Shin, was being interviewed. The interviewer then asks him one last question, asking for advice for medical students who dream of becoming a great surgeon. Professor Bakyu Shin thinks for a moment before answering the question. Very humbly, he says he doesn't consider himself a great surgeon yet to be giving advice. Young Seon-han watches intently as the host comments that the doctor is praised for having the hands of a god. Despite the recognition, the professor insists he still has a long way to go. He goes on to say that there's an old 200-year-old European saying that might help. According to him, to become an exceptional surgeon, 3 qualities are needed. The first is to have the eye of an eagle, the second is to possess the hand of a lady, and finally the third quality is to have the heart of a lion. Bakyu Shin explains that a doctor needs observation skills as sharp as an eagle's. Furthermore, one must be gentle and careful like the hand of a lady. At the same time, a surgeon needs the fearless determination and decisiveness of a lion. His words echo in young Seon-han's mind, leaving him completely mesmerized. To the boy, that man, Bakyu Shin, was the coolest person in the world. That interview became a ray of light for the protagonist, who had been lost since his mother's passing. He remembers a saying that a person who finds a bright light in the darkness will walk towards that light for the rest of their life. And for our protagonist, that light was becoming a doctor. Because of this, in a moment of pure determination, young Seon-han yells to his father that he's going to become a doctor. To the boy's surprise, his father rejects his dream bluntly and without hesitation, leaving him completely shocked. He then questions the reason for the refusal. After all, any father would be happy with a son wanting to pursue such a career. The man then asks what kind of family they are, leaving young Shin Seon-han totally confused. He then begins to explain that they are a family of merchants with roots in the Joseon era, established in the market for 30 years. With great pride, he boasts that their restaurant has been featured on television 12 times. On top of that, the restaurant has thousands of visitor reviews and a stellar rating of 4.89. He says all this to praise the famous Shin family sashimi restaurant. Given all this, he declares that his son's destiny is not to be a doctor, but a master of sashimi knives. The father continues, saying that Seon-han is a natural with knives, just like him, and should use this gift to continue the family business. Our protagonist argues back, saying that although he likes cutting fish, his true desire is to become a doctor who saves people with a knife. Despite his plea, his father denies his request, leaving the boy with no hope. Frustrated, young Seon-han throws a fit, questioning why he can't follow his dream when he's studying so hard for it. The father explains that's precisely the problem, because his son doesn't have the brains for studying, so he's brutally honest and says the boy takes after him and is as as thick as a brick. With painful sincerity, the father apologizes but states that their family doesn't have the brains for academics, and becoming a doctor is impossible. To try and cheer him up, the father shows him a rare grouper and asks his son to fillet it. However, the boy refuses to accept this fate, and yells with determination that if he fails, he'll keep trying, no matter how many times it takes. And in a few seconds, he fillets the fish perfectly. After finishing the dish, he runs out of the house, shouting that he will definitely become a doctor. Unfortunately, reality wasn't easy, and his grades were too low to get into medical school. But he doesn't give up and promises himself he'll get into medical school, no matter what it takes. In a moment of distraction, his sister enters the room, asking him to sew her torn skirt. He initially refuses but ends up giving in and sews her skirt with impressive skill. After helping her, the protagonist kicks her out of the room, yelling that he needs to study. The truth is, besides being good with knives, he was also an excellent tailor, but his focus was on the entrance exams. On results day, he anxiously checks for his acceptance, but unfortunately, he's rejected. Unfazed by the rejection, our protagonist immediately starts studying for a second attempt, but the result is the same, and he gets rejected once again, while his dad has a bizarre celebration in the background. Even so, giving up wasn't an option, and he dedicates himself to his studies for a third and final attempt. From then on, after a lot of hard work, results day finally arrives, and to everyone's joy, a celebratory banner is hung in front of the family restaurant. With that, on his third try, the protagonist finally makes it, and takes a photo with his family to capture the moment. He had finally achieved his dream and become a medical student. Our protagonist thought nothing else could go wrong, but he had no idea what was waiting for him. Faced with a protest that shut down his university, he drops to his knees, completely devastated. The expression on his face shows all the despair of seeing his dream crumble. Defeated, he simply decides to go home and fillet some fish. After a while, we see him at a bus stop, reflecting on his uncertain future. And then he comes across a huge hospital building. It turns out the college closed, but luckily, he managed to pass the medical licensing exam, and was accepted as an intern at Yeongguk University Hospital. And this wasn't just any hospital, but one of the 5 largest and most prestigious in Korea. Yeongguk University Hospital is massive, with a flow of 8,000 outpatients a day and over 2,000 inpatients. Because of this, the medical staff is huge, with thousands of doctors, nurses, and technicians working non-stop. But what matters most to Shin Son-han is that this was the workplace of his great idol, Professor Baekyu Shine, and that was the main reason he applied to intern right there. He takes a deep breath and prepares himself, as his journey to become the doctor he always dreamed of is just beginning. With steady steps, the protagonist enters the hospital, ready for his first day of work. As soon as he arrives, a nurse calls him over, saying the patient in room 1705 is having chest pain and needs an EKG. He understands that in cardiology, a quick EKG is essential, and since it's a typical intern task, he starts prepping the patient. The test results come out quickly, showing the patient's heartbeats. Analyzing the chart, Shun Son-han notices that the results look a little different from the previous day. He takes the results to the nurse and suggests they notify the doctor in charge, but she seems skeptical and asks what's different. Our protagonist explains that it looks like atrial fibrillation, and although it's not serious yet, he thinks it should be checked by his superior. The nurse is impressed with the intern's attention to detail, even on his first shift, and comments that he'll be well liked if he keeps it up. Awkwardly, he lets out a little laugh and says he really hopes that happens. Suddenly, an older doctor shows up with a sour look on his face and asks what the two of them are chatting about instead of working. This intimidating doctor is Kim Byum-soo, a third-year resident known as Kim the Cobra. Our protagonist gets nervous and quickly bows in respect. Greeting the doctor, one of the other doctors whispers to Kim Byum-soo that the intern is from Ilwon University. With contempt, the coworker explains that it's that third-rate regional school that shut down the previous year for corruption. Kim the Cobra looks at Shin Son-han with a disdainful gaze, which makes our protagonist quite uncomfortable. Kim then gets straight to the point, asking if he checked on the patient with chest pain. Our protagonist replies that he did and hands over the EKG result. Kim Byum-soo then asks for the previous night's chart, and the intern promptly hands it over. Our protagonist explains that the previous night, the patient's heart rhythm was normal, but in the morning, it changed to atrial fibrillation. He adds that it's not serious yet, but it would be good to check it anyway. The doctor glares at him menacingly, making the intern feel like a frog about to be eaten by a snake. Kim the Cobra asks bluntly what the kid from Owun's name is, and without hesitation, our protagonist replies that his name is Shin Son-han. After a few tense seconds, the doctor smacks the clipboard in his hand, and surprisingly, he praises the intern's work, leaving him completely shocked by the unexpected reaction. Dr. Kim Byum-soo continues, saying it's it's great when an intern organizes everything so well and can also interpret the results. Our protagonist breathes a sigh of relief, thinking it was worth preparing the previous day's records in advance. He knows he needs to make a good impression because although the attendings decide the final grade, the residents are the first evaluators. Kim the Cobra then drops a snarky comment, implying that someone from a defunct school would have to work way harder to be an intern there. He hands the documents back to Shin Seon-han and tells him to work hard and learn a lot before walking away. The doctor's words hit him hard, as he was basically saying there was no chance of him staying at the hospital. Kim Byum-soo explains that no matter how hard someone from another school tries, it's very difficult to survive in that competitive environment. Shin Seon-han replies that he came prepared for that, but the resident just says that's good for him. The doctor adjusts his glasses and prepares to continue the conversation. Our protagonist then asks if there would be a chance if he were chosen as the intern of the year. The question leaves Kim Byum-soo momentarily speechless. The title of intern of the year is a great honor bestowed annually upon an outstanding intern at Yongguk University Hospital. For Shin Seon-han, being chosen as intern of the year would mean his chances of becoming a full-fledged doctor at the hospital would be almost 100%. However, the other doctor butts in, asking why Kim the Cobra is giving him false hope since an outsider has never been chosen as intern of the year. Ignoring the negative comment, Kim Byum-soo says the opportunity exists and that the protagonist should work hard to try for it. Our protagonist thanks him for the guidance and bows respectfully as the doctors walk away. Alone, he fumes at the hospital's elitism but promises himself he will survive there, no matter the cost, and he doesn't just want to survive one day, he wants to take a picture next to his idol. He dreams of being recognized as an excellent doctor, just like Professor Baekyu Shine. His thoughts are interrupted by a female voice cheerfully greeting him. It's one of his fellow interns inviting him to lunch. He replies that he was just about to go and asks if she's already eaten, but she says she needs to finish a ton of paperwork first. His colleague vents that she needs to collect signatures on 5 surgery consent forms as soon as possible. Seeing the girl's desperation, Shin Seon-han holds out his hand and offers to help her get some of the signatures. She's surprised and happy with the offer, and he tells her to finish her work and come back soon. The colleague thanks him excitedly, saying he saved her life. She hands him the forms and promises to buy him coffee later as a thank you. Our protagonist gives a slight smile as he watches her walk away. He then takes the papers and starts checking which patients need to sign the forms. As he reads the names on the forms, one of them catches his eye, Kim Jung-soo. Our protagonist freezes as that name sounds very familiar. He immediately remembers the dream he had on the train, where the doctor declared the passing of patient Kim Jung-soo, and the time of passing recorded was exactly at 3:22 in the morning. He tries to convince himself it's just a coincidence and heads to the patient's room. When he reaches the door, he takes a deep breath before entering. He introduces himself and asks the patient to review and sign the consent form. Upon entering the room, he finds the patient in bed, accompanied by a woman. But when he looks at the patient's face, the protagonist is completely in shock. Graying hair, deep-set, drooping eyes, dark. They were the exact same features as the man he saw in his dream. That was definitely the same patient. He then looks at the ID on the room door and confirms the name Kim Jung-soo. The woman next to the patient asks what brings him there. A bit lost, the protagonist stammers slightly. He then composes himself and explains that he came to talk about the procedure the patient will be having that day. He then begins to explain the details to the patient and his companion. As he speaks, he tries to convince himself that it's all just a huge coincidence. His thoughts are interrupted by the woman calling his name. She asks with a worried expression if her father will be alright. Reading the form, she saw there was a risk of not making it through the procedure. Shin Seon-han reassures her, telling her not to worry, as they list all possible complications, even the rarest ones. He continues explaining that the procedure is performed more than 10 times a day and all of last week's patients were discharged without any issues, and with a confident smile he states that the chance of a fatal accident is almost zero. After all, this is Yongguk University Hospital, and the best doctors in Korea work there, so nothing would go wrong. The protagonist's words seem to calm the woman, who now has a more relaxed expression. She turns to her father and tells him not to be afraid, and the man nods in agreement. Our protagonist says goodbye with a smile and leaves the room, feeling more confident. Time passes and night falls over the hospital. Shin Seon-han finally finishes his shift at 8 in the evening, completely exhausted. However, his day isn't over yet, as he's on night duty. He rushes to the intern dorms to try and get some rest before it starts. When he gets there, he finds one of his roommates sweating while lifting weights. The muscular roommate is training hard, and the sound of the weights echoes through the room. He lifts the bar with impressive strength. Our protagonist recognizes his roommate, Kim Jun-wook, and asks if he was working out. The guy replies with a smile that he can't skip his workout or he'll lose muscle mass. He then comments that Shin Seon-han looks terrible, and the the protagonist collapses onto the bed, explaining that the day was extremely hectic. Kim Jun-wook then asks if he's heard the story going around the hospital. He says that every March, when the new interns arrive, a major incident always happens at the hospital. Our protagonist, lying in bed, tells him not to jinx it, as he's hoping for a quiet shift. His roommate agrees, and they both hope for a calm and incident-free night. Lying in bed, our protagonist can't stop thinking about the dream where patient Kim Jung-soo passed away. He shoots up, startled, trying to shake off these ridiculous thoughts. But the worry won't leave him alone, and he gets out of bed, determined to do something about it. His roommate sees him grabbing his lab coat and gets confused. He asks if Shin Seon-han is going to study, and the protagonist replies that he needs to research something. His friend sees that he's reading a book on coronary heart disease, and is surprised that someone would study during their internship. Our protagonist thinks that although things probably won't happen like in the dream, he needs to be prepared for that 1 in a million chance. The clock shows it's almost 2 in the morning. While his roommate sleeps soundly, Shin Seon-han continues to study and research late into the night. He dedicates himself to his studies while his friend sleeps on the top bunk. After a long time, he stretches exhausted, complaining that it's hard to study after so long. Suddenly, the hospital's PA system announces an emergency code. The message reports a cardiopulmonary arrest on the 17th floor, West Wing, and all interns are summoned. Shin Seon-han yells for his roommate Jun-wook to run as they both bolt down the hospital corridor. The situation is a CPR, the biggest emergency that can happen in a hospital, where the patient's life hangs by a thread with every second. Their colleague, Yeon Seo, appears, running and yelling for them to wait for her at the elevator, and joins them. Inside the elevator, one of the interns comments that the patients on the 17th floor were stable earlier, while Yeon Seo says she has no idea who had the cardiac arrest. As soon as the door opens, the group of interns runs desperately down the hall towards the treatment room. Upon arriving, they are met with a furious doctor's shout. The doctor scolds them harshly for being late when a patient's life is on the line, asking if they're already slacking off after just 1 month as interns. They all bow an apology, and the doctor orders one of them to take the ambu bag while the others get ready for compressions. Our protagonist knows that chest compressions must continue for at least 30 minutes unless the patient regains spontaneous circulation. One of the interns starts chest compressions on the patient while someone else uses the oxygen bag. Suddenly, Shin Seon-han realizes something terrible. The patient on the gurney is exactly Kim Jung-soo, the same man from his nightmare. Our protagonist is utterly terrified, wondering how this is possible and if his dream is really coming true. At that moment, the head doctor orders them to charge the defibrillator to 200 joules and for everyone to clear the patient. The doctor applies the shock to the patient's chest in an attempt to revive him. Unsuccessful, he orders them to charge the defibrillator again, and another electric shock is applied to the patient. To everyone's relief, the heart rhythm finally returns to normal. The heart monitor shows stable beats, and the emergency situation is declared over. The interns breathe a sigh of relief after all the tension, but the head doctor gives them no rest and gets everyone's attention. He warns them that the later they arrive, the less time they'll have to save the patient. Then, the doctor decides to test the interns' knowledge and asks how often the ambu bag should be squeezed during intubation. The young doctors hesitate, not knowing the exact answer. The doctor taunts them, saying they can't even answer a simple question. Our protagonist realizes the situation can't go on like this. He raises his hand and confidently answers that when the airway is secure, the ambu bag should be squeezed once every 6 seconds. The doctor looks at Shin Seon-han with a serious expression, but says nothing. The protagonist feels a bit tense, waiting for the doctor's reaction. The doctor continues the interrogation with increasingly specific questions. He asks about the diastolic pressure during compressions, and our protagonist answers correctly. The intra-arterial blood pressure during diastole should be above 20 millimeters of mercury. The doctor then questions the amiodarone dosage for a shockable rhythm. Shin Seon-han replies that the first dose is 300 milligrams, and then 150 milligrams should be administered. After the series of correct answers, the doctor is silent for a moment. With a smirk, he praises Shin Seon-han, saying at least one person here is on the ball. Our protagonist thinks to himself that he only managed to answer so quickly because the scene from his dream kept replaying in his head all day. The doctor then turns to the other interns and scolds them for not knowing the basics. He gets especially ticked off at the Yeonguk grads, asking if they aren't embarrassed to be outdone by someone from a defunct university. The other interns are clearly embarrassed by the scolding. The doctor then yells for them to get out of his sight. As they walk down the hall, Shin Seon-han's colleagues comment that the situation ended quickly and that Kim the Cobra let them go early. The muscular friend complains about the doctor's terrible personality and says he hates him so much he'll never go into internal medicine. Our protagonist feels relieved that patient Kim Jung-soo is safe, but at the same time he has a strange feeling that he's forgetting something important. The image from the dream comes back to haunt our protagonist. He looks at his phone and sees it's 2:40 in the morning. He remembers that the time of passing in the dream was at 3:22. The events of the dream have already played out exactly once, and if the dream comes true again, patient Kim Jung-soo will be gone in 40 minutes. Determined to prevent this, he tells his colleagues to go on ahead. They ask where he's going, and our protagonist replies that something about the patient is bothering him. His colleague Yeon-seo decides to go with him and asks what's unusual about the patient. The two of them run back to Kim Jung-soo's room. The patient is sleeping peacefully with the help of a ventilator. Shin Seon-han asks his colleague if she noticed anything strange about the patient, and she tries to remember. She then recalls passing him in the hallway earlier that day, and the patient smelled like cigarettes. The information surprises our protagonist. The girl explains that she wondered if the smell was really coming from the patient, but got distracted by other tasks. Shin Seon-han reflects that smoking isn't something that causes an immediate problem, but if the patient couldn't resist the addiction even before heart surgery, it shows how severe his dependency is. With this new clue in mind, he rushes to the medical cart's computer to check the patient's file. Accessing the records, he discovers alarming information about Kim Jung-soo's health. The patient's file shows an 80-pack-year history of smoking, an absurdly high number that shocks our protagonist. The guy from Awoon turns pale as he realizes the man's situation is much more serious than he imagined. And to make matters worse, the chart reveals the patient has hypertension, diabetes, and dyslipidemia. Basically, every possible risk factor for blood vessels. On top of all that, his heart's ejection fraction is only 35%, which means its pumping capacity is severely compromised. His colleague Yeon-seo is shocked and comments that with a chart like this, it wouldn't be surprising if complications arose, and Shin Seon-han agrees with her. He then explains that the procedure the patient had is to unblock the heart's arteries. In this procedure, a small metal tube called a stent is inserted to keep the artery open, but since it's a foreign object in the body, problems can occur. Given this information, he wonders how the patient ends up passing away in the dream, since he had stabilized earlier. Desperate, Young Seon-han tries to force his mind to remember any crucial detail from the dream that he might have forgotten. As he pulls his own hair in frustration, a sudden memory flashes in his mind. He remembers a specific term he heard in the dream: refractory ventricular fibrillation, a malignant cardiac arrhythmia that doesn't respond to shocks or medication. He panics because he knows that if this condition manifests, the chance of the patient not making it is extremely high. Faced with the urgency, our protagonist draws Yeon-seo's attention to the heart monitor and points to something strange on the graph. The intern explains that the rhythm is changing slowly and that there are some weird waveforms that look like noise. The girl confesses she can't see the difference, but now that he's mentioned it, it does seem like something is wrong. Without a second thought, the guy from Ilwoon runs out of the room to alert his superiors about the imminent danger. His colleague Yeon-seo is left behind, completely shocked by the gravity of the situation. When he finds his superior, the news of the patient's worsening condition hits like a bombshell. Kim Byung-soo gets angry and questions if the intern is trying to lecture him just because he got a little praise earlier. Our protagonist tries to explain, stammering, but the doctor cuts him off sharply. Kim the Cobra continues his lecture, asking how he's supposed to interpret a newbie trying to give advice to an experienced resident. Young Seon-han is frozen with fear, not knowing how to react to the doctor's fury. The older doctor glares at him with a look of pure contempt and anger. Then he gets up from his chair and pokes the intern's chest aggressively with his finger. The doctor yells, asking who gave him permission to assess a patient's condition on his own, and tells him to just do as he's told. Defeated, the kid regrets opening his mouth and thinks he should have kept quiet, since he's no superhero who can see the future. But to our protagonist's surprise, the doctor asks what the situation is, leaving our guy completely surprised. Kim then challenges him to give his opinion, since he's so insistent on having one, and asks sarcastically if diagnosing and treating aren't basic skills for a doctor. He then pressures him, asking if Shin Seon-han is scared to take responsibility now that he's spoken up. Our protagonist realizes there's no turning back and decides to see it through. So, Young Seon-han shouts that he believes the patient might need an ECMO procedure. The suggestion completely catches the resident off guard, who asks what that is. ECMO is basically a life support machine that replaces the function of the heart, considered the last hope for terminal patients. Kim Byung-soo is utterly perplexed, wondering what's going through the intern's head to suggest something so extreme. He then taunts him, asking if the kid has ever seen an ECMO at his third-rate college or if he's just repeating something he saw on TV. The older doctor explodes with anger, yelling that the machine isn't a miracle cure and is only used as a last resort. The guy from Ilwoon defends his point, explaining that due to the patient's precarious condition, the chance of a serious complication is real. Kim the Cobra just gives a mocking smile, finding the whole situation situation hilarious. To finish, he asks with disdain if the newbie's opinion is that a recently stabilized patient is just gonna have the worst possible arrhythmia out of nowhere. Without hesitation, our protagonist confirms his opinion with a loud highs, while inwardly he can't believe he actually did that. The guy from Elwoon knows that challenging a proud resident won't do him any good and that his evaluation in internal medicine is already toast. But to our protagonist's surprise, Kim gives in and admits that the possibility raised by the intern isn't entirely impossible, leaving the kid confused. Faced with the situation, the doctor picks up the phone from the desk and calls another doctor to confirm if he's on duty. Young Sonhan and his colleague Yeon Seo exchange glances, not understanding the resident's sudden change of heart. Sometime later, patient Kim Jong-soo is transferred to an ICU room, and there he is placed under intensive care and constant monitoring. Back in the room, the intimidating doctor informs them that he has already notified thoracic surgery and moved the patient to the ICU, then asks if the intern is satisfied. Our protagonist, with a smile of relief, thanks his superior for his actions. Kim Byum-soo comments that he's never seen a newbie like him before, and that he will definitely remember his name. He then repeats the name Shin Seonhan with a serious expression to emphasize that he won't forget. After the warning, the doctor turns and leaves the room, leaving the two interns alone. As soon as he's gone, his colleague Yeon Seo lets out a huge sigh of relief that all the tension has finally passed, and then gets super excited and congratulates him, saying he was amazing for standing up to Kim the Cobra like that. Our protagonist replies that he doesn't even know where he found the courage and is now worried about the consequences. As they walk down the hall, the girl says she thought his actions were really cool, surprising the guy with the comment. She continues the praise with a smile and says he looked like a real doctor. Young Seonhan gives an awkward laugh and shyly thanks her for the compliment. Back in the ICU, the heart monitor shows that patient Kim Jong-soo's condition remains stable, so the two interns sit by the bed to watch the patient closely. The hours pass and the clock now reads 3:02 in the morning. The intern gets anxious because, according to his dream, the second cardiac arrest should happen soon, but nothing seems to be changing. Yeon Seo starts dozing off in her chair and slumps right onto our protagonist. The girl vehemently denies she was sleeping while our protagonist is dying of pain. Seeing how tired she is, the guy from Ulwoon suggests they head back to the dorm, but she asks if they aren't going to watch the patient anymore. He replies that they've checked enough and that maybe he was worried for nothing. With a sense of relief, the kid prepares to leave, taking one last look at the peacefully sleeping patient. However, the moment he turns, the monitor's alarm goes off and they both look back, completely shocked. A nurse panics when she sees the graph and yells that the patient is in ventricular fibrillation, calling for urgent medical help. In response to the situation, the emergency alarm blares throughout the ICU, indicating the immediate need for CPR. The nurse calls for a doctor, but our protagonist is frozen for a moment as he sees his nightmare becoming a reality. He then snaps out of it and runs towards the patient to start the life-saving procedure. The intern yells for his colleague Yeon Seo to get the oxygen bag while he prepares for chest compressions. As he positions his hands on the man's chest, he can hardly believe that the content of his dream was real all along, and completely terrified by the situation, he wonders how he's going to handle it all. The emergency alarm echoes throughout the hospital, and soon after, Kim the Cobra and another doctor come running down the hallway. Upon entering the room, Kim Byum-soo's colleague is startled and confirms the patient is in ventricular fibrillation. The older doctor realizes the gravity of the situation and yells for them to switch places with him so he can take over compressions. With that, Kim the Cobra starts chest compressions with all his might, while the guy from Ilwoon just watches the scene. At that moment, it clicks for our protagonist, and he remembers that the situation is exactly the same as in his nightmare. The memory of the dream comes flooding back, with all the medical team shouts and the same desperation in the air. It dawns on the kid, and he realizes that the scene he saw in his dream is repeating itself perfectly right in front of him. One of the other doctors checks the monitor and reports that the heart rhythm hasn't returned and asks them to stop compressions for a moment. Without wasting time, Kim Byum-soo orders them to charge the defibrillator to 200 joules and applies the shock to the patient's chest. Shin Seonhan watches everything terrified, because if the situation continues to follow the dream script, patient Kim Jong-soo is going to be gone right there in front of him. Meanwhile, outside the ICU, the man's daughter cries inconsolably, calling out for her father. The intern has a vision of the patient, already lifeless on the gurney, with the medical team around him, unable to do anything more. He then feels completely helpless and wonders if he was unable to change the future even though he knew what was going to happen. But suddenly, an authoritative voice yells for everyone to get out of the way, surprising young Seonhan and his colleague. A thoracic surgery team rushes in the ICU, pushing the ECMO machine. Our protagonist is filled with hope because the only people who can save the patient in this desperate situation have finally arrived. The team is led by thoracic surgery specialist Song Yoo-ju, a doctor with a serious and determined demeanor. Without wasting a second, the surgeon approaches and asks how long they've been trying to resuscitate the patient. Young Seonhan answers frantically that it's been 6 cycles, totaling 12 minutes of chest compressions. With that information, Song Yoo-ju prepares for the procedure and tells everyone to step back as they will be using both femorals. Right after, a green surgical drape is quickly thrown over the patient. The drape covers the lower part of Kim Jung-soo's body, leaving only the thigh area exposed for the procedure. The medical team then begins inserting the ECMO equipment to try and save the man's life. The surgeon instructs her assistant to start on the medial side to access the vein first. A needle is carefully inserted into the patient's thigh region. Upon pulling the plunger, blood fills the syringe, confirming the vein has been successfully found. Soon after, Song Yoo-ju asks for the guide wire, and her assistant promptly hands it to her. The thin metal wire is then passed through the needle into the blood vessel. Looking at the ultrasound, one of the doctors confirms that the guide wire has reached the inferior vena cava, a super important blood vessel. With the guide wire in place, the medical team continues the procedure with impressive precision. Surgeon Song Yoo-ju gives the next order to find the artery, explaining that the blood will come out bright red due to oxygenation. Surgeon Song Yoo-ju gives the next order to find the artery, explaining that the blood will come out bright red due to oxygenation. However, a problem arises when the assistant tries to puncture the artery, but the blood simply won't enter the syringe. The doctor is surprised by the unexpected complication, and then he informs the specialist that the blood flow has suddenly stopped. Faced with the setback, Song Yoo-ju acts quickly and orders them to immediately stop chest compressions on the patient. She then instructs her assistant to try pulling the syringe again, but this time slowly and carefully. Following her guidance, the doctor succeeds, and bright red blood finally fills the syringe. The specialist asks if he got it, and the assistant confirms the success of the procedure. With the artery found, the surgeon instructs him to pass the guide wire slowly and warns him to stop at the slightest sign of resistance so as not to harm the patient. After the careful insertion of the guide wire, the assistant excitedly yells that the procedure was a success. With everything in place, a member of the medical team turns on the ECMO machine. Soon after, the patient's blood begins to flow through the machine's circuit, and the tubes fill with blood, initiating the extracorporeal life support. Right after, the oxygenated, bright red blood begins to flow through the tubes back into the patient's body. With that, the machine completely takes over the function of Kim Jung-soo's heart and lungs, stabilizing his critical condition. Specialist Song Yoo-ju observes the equipment and confirms that the flow is good and there are no recirculation issues. Because of this, the man's breathing finally normalizes, and he appears to be in a much more stable state. Given the success of the procedure, the surgeon praises her team, saying they all did a great job. On the other side of the room, our protagonist lets out a sigh of relief, completely exhausted after all the tension. Suddenly, young Seonhan's gaze is drawn to the clock on the wall, which reads exactly 3:22 in the morning. He is completely shocked, as that is the exact time of passing he saw in his nightmare. However, unlike what happened in the dream, patient Kim Jung-soo did not pass away this time. The man survived thanks to the ECMO, which now acts as his second heart, and the next step is to find and fix the original problem. Meanwhile, a head doctor arrives hurriedly and asks Kim the Cobra what happened there. The resident explains that the patient had a sudden cardiac arrest, and since the rhythm wouldn't return, they had to use ECMO. Specialist Song Yoo-ju completes the explanation, saying that luckily, they were contacted in advance thanks to Dr. Kim Byum-soo's request. Kim the Cobra then looks at our protagonist and reveals that the suggestion actually came from the intern. The head doctor is overjoyed with the news and slaps Kim the Cobra on the back, congratulating him on the great work without even noticing the correction. Our protagonist just watches as the head doctor says it was a close call. After the emergency ends, the hospital's waiting room returns to its usual calm, completely empty. At another moment, young Seonan holds a few coins in his hand. From there, he goes to a vending machine to buy a drink and relax a bit. As he stares at the products, he wonders if what he saw in his dream was really the future, and how that could be possible. His colleague Yeon-si approaches him with a worried expression and asks if he's okay. The girl says she was only responsible for the oxygen bag, so she didn't get as tired as he did. Soon after, she gets curious and asks how he knew patient Kim Jung-soo would have a relapse. The intern is also wondering about that, as there's no way it could be just a coincidence with so many details matching up perfectly. Without a good answer, he scratches his head and says with an awkward smile that it was just a hunch. Yeon-seo gives him a look that says she didn't believe that story one bit. Suddenly, the two of them jump out of their skin when Kim Byum-soo silently appears right behind them. The intimidating doctor glares at them with his typical unfriendly face and tells them to get out of the way if they're not buying anything. With his warning, a can of coffee drops into the machine's compartment. Then, Kim the Cobra's hand grabs the drink he just bought. Before leaving, the intimidating doctor admits that our protagonist was right this time, surprising the young man. Kim the Cobra continues and says that moving the patient to the ICU and calling the ECMO team was the right call. However, he quickly reverts to his normal personality and yells at the intern not to get a big head, as it was pure luck. He then holds out the can of coffee to Shin Sonhan, and with a smirk, he praises the work of the kid from the defunct university. After this unexpected acknowledgement, Kim Byum-soo turns and walks away, leaving the two newbies behind. They stand there, speechless, holding the drink the resident gave them as a gift. Suddenly, his colleague Yeon Seo lets out a super excited scream, startling our protagonist. The girl says the guy from Woon just received a confession and explains that Kim the Cobra has never given anything to anyone before. She continues the joke, saying that getting a drink from him is practically a declaration of love, and young Seonhan is completely terrified by the idea. After all the confusion, the intern looks at the can of coffee in his hand, still processing everything that happened. He still can't understand what that dream was and how it showed exactly what was going to happen. The kid decides not to think too much about it, and just accept that he managed to save a life. Thus, he feels satisfied for having helped a patient survive, and that's enough for now. On another day, the sun shines over Yeongguk University Hospital, illuminating the large building with a light of hope. Our protagonist finally enjoys a day off and celebrates the feeling of freedom with his roommate, Kim Jun-wook. The muscular roommate says he's going to the gym, and young Seonhan replies that he's going home to catch up on all his missed sleep. Suddenly, his colleague Yeon Seo appears and slaps the guy from Woon on the back, almost knocking him to the ground. The girl jokes that his back is broad and good for slapping, while he complains about the sudden assault. She then asks about patient Kim Jung-soo, and the intern informs her that the surgery went well, and he should be discharged soon. With the good news, our protagonist feels relieved, as the case had been bothering him quite a bit. His colleague Yeon Seo then invites him to go somewhere with her, but he's confused about what she's talking about. The girl explains that she got a message from another colleague for all the interns to meet up for drinks. Young Seonhan is surprised because he didn't get any message, and she suggests he was forgotten and invites him to come along. She then asks the muscular roommate to come too, but he declines the invitation because he needs to train. The guy from Woon tries to use the excuse of going home to sleep, but his colleague won't take no for an answer. The girl drags him by the collar of his shirt, saying the weather is too nice to be wasted sleeping. With that, they end up going to a restaurant called Yeongguk Chicken to meet the other interns. When they arrive, she greets everyone cheerfully while our protagonist stands awkwardly beside her. The arrival of their colleague Yeon Seo is met with great enthusiasm by the other interns, who call her the goddess of the medical school. His colleague Yeon Seo sits next to our protagonist and invites him to join the table, but one of the other interns looks at the guy from Ilwoon with contempt and wonders why he came along with her. The annoyed kid slams his glass on the table, showing his displeasure with the presence of an outsider. Meanwhile, another intern talks to the girl and complains that it's the first time he's gone out since the internship started. Meanwhile, another intern talks to the girl and complains that it's the first time he's gone out since the internship started. With a cheerful toast, the guy shouts that he's going to drink until he drops and invites everyone to join him. Our protagonist watches the party from the sidelines, feeling like a fish out of water. He notices that all the graduates from Yeongguk University are very close and feels a bit envious of their friendship. Suddenly, the intern who was complaining earlier turns to him and asks for his name with a mocking tone. The guy from Woon confirms his name, and the other invites him for a drink in a very forced way. He then pours a drink for our protagonist and asks how he's adjusting, being from another school. Before he can answer, his colleague Yeon Seo chimes in and asks if they've heard the rumors about young Seonhan. With a mischievous smile, she starts telling everyone the story of how he managed to impress the feared Kim the Cobra. The gossip spreads through the bar. All the interns are completely shocked by the news, and one of them even jokes that the coffee he got was poisoned and that the end of the world had come. After hearing the story, the attitude of the other interns changes completely, and they start to see our protagonist as a real pro for having tamed Kim the Cobra. With that, the guy from Ilwoon finally feels like part of the group and drinks with his colleagues, no longer an outcast. Soon after, one of the guys brings up a new topic and asks which medical specialty each of them is thinking of pursuing. This is a conversation that never fails at intern gatherings, as choosing a specialty is one of the most important moments of their careers. The decision is super important since the chosen field will define their entire professional lives as doctors. One of the interns mentions he's considering rehabilitation medicine or radiology, but another colleague makes fun of him. Another guy has already made his decision and states he's going into anesthesiology because it's a field that's currently in high demand. The conversation then turns to Yeon Seo, and one of her colleagues asks if she still wants to do pediatrics, but she says she's having doubts because she heard it's very tough. One of them then suggests dermatology for her, and the girl just smiles, saying she's considering several options. The truth is, the most popular specialties are always the same, like dermatology, ophthalmology, and plastic surgery. Thus, the fields that make the most most money or are less physically demanding end up being the most sought after by everyone. At that moment, Yan Seo turns to our protagonist and asks what specialty he's considering. The other intern, who previously looked down on him, now seems curious to hear the opinion of a student from another university. Shin Seonhan replies that for now, he's thinking of going into surgery, which impresses everyone at the table. He finishes by saying he also found the thoracic surgery team amazing, and the other colleagues get super excited about the idea. The colleagues' excitement has a reason, as thoracic surgery is one of the most unpopular and avoided specialties because it's very dangerous and exhausting. One of the guys asks why he would choose something so intense. Our protagonist replies with an awkward smile that he just thinks the field is cool. He imagines himself as a great surgeon, with his back to the operating room door, ready to start a procedure. In his imagination, he holds out his hand and asks for the scalpel with unshakable confidence, finding the whole scene super stylish. The other interns join in the fun, saying that nowadays everyone does what they want and that it no longer matters to follow the popular specialties. With that, they all make a cheerful toast in honor of the brave choice of the guy from a wound. However, the same intern who looked down on him before takes a sip of his beer with a disdainful expression. Completely drunk, he stands up and accuses our protagonist of not choosing surgery out of his own will, but because it's his only option. He continues his hate-filled speech, saying that coming from a defunct university, young Seonhan has no chance of getting a spot in the more competitive specialties. Another colleague tries to intervene and tells the drunk to shut up, but he doesn't listen. The guy keeps yelling that no one there has a chance in the more popular fields if they're not from Yangguk University, and that everyone is just pretending to cheer for them. He ends his pathetic speech by wondering if he's the only one who thinks this way before being reprimanded by the others. With his face all red and cheeks puffed out, he holds back the urge to throw up, but he can't hold it in and runs out of the bar so as not to make a mess, while one of his colleagues follows to help him. Our protagonist is confused by the situation and wonders why Jo Jin-ji hates him so much since he hasn't done anything wrong. One of the other colleagues approaches and tells him not to take it personally, as the guy is completely wasted, and Shin Seonhan replies that it's okay. Young Seonhan holds his glass and thinks that in hospital life, it's impossible to only meet good people. He reflects that after spending their whole lives studying, it's normal for some people not to have great social skills and that grades don't define character. After all, just because someone is a doctor who deals with lives doesn't mean they're mature and have a good personality. As he takes a sip of his drink, the guy from Ilwoon's eyes suddenly widen. Again, time and space begin to warp around him, leaving him completely stunned. Our protagonist finds himself alone in a dark place and realizes it's the same feeling as last time. From there, he has a vision of a big commotion while someone yells to hold a guy back. The scene shows the drunk in turn causing a fight in the bar, with broken bottles all over the floor. Next, he sees himself all bruised up with a bleeding head while his colleagues rush to help him. Young Seonhan is completely confused seeing the image of his injured self right in front of him. His eyes widen in pure shock at the terrible premonition he just had. He then snaps back to reality with Yeon Seo's worried voice calling his name. His colleague asks what happened, as he completely spaced out all of a sudden, but he just says it was nothing. Our protagonist is utterly confused and wonders if he had another one of those strange dreams. He remembers the vision he had and fears that everything will happen exactly the same way as last time, but the guy from Ilwoon tries to convince himself that it was just a coincidence and that he doesn't have any superpowers. With the excuse of going to the restroom, he gets up from the table to try and cool his head. As he walks, he thinks he should have gone home to sleep, and that the strange dreams are just a result of exhaustion. Once outside the bar, he decides the mood has already been ruined by the drunk colleague, and that he'll say his goodbyes and leave. Suddenly, he spots a stack of drink crates and realizes they're the same ones he saw in his premonition. At that exact moment, Jo Jin, the drunk intern, returns to the bar, struggling while the others try to hold him back. In the midst of the chaos, the guy loses his balance and bumps into the stack of crates. Just as it had happened in his premonition, the glass bottles then fall and shatter on the floor, making a huge noise. The fall causes a big mess, and the other colleagues rush to help Jo Jin-ji, who fell in the middle of it all. Yeon Seo approaches worried and asks if young Seonhan is okay, and he replies that he is. However, when he looks to the side, he sees that the drunk intern got cut by the glass shards, exactly as in his vision. Shocked, he realizes the same thing happened again and starts to question if he really has the power to see the future. Back at Yangguk University Hospital, young Seonhan tries to organize his thoughts. He jots down in a notebook everything he's figured out about his premonitions so far. The first thing he notices is that the visions happen suddenly, and time around him seems to stop. The premonitions always show incidents and accidents that are about to happen near him, and the time between the vision and the actual event is irregular, ranging from minutes to a full day. For now, he's only had 2 visions, so he can't be sure, but he fears this will become more frequent, as hospitals are full of accidents. With this new reality in mind, he squints with determination. From now on, he will have have to make a choice every time he has a new vision, and, with a pen in hand, he needs to decide whether he will change the future with his own hands or simply let things happen. He then writes in his notebook with a serious expression on his face. With his choice, he can change the future and save lives. Thus, the hectic month of March comes to an end, marking the beginning of a new phase for our protagonist. On another day, the intern brings a food tray to one of his patients, a friendly elderly lady. The old woman is sad to hear it's his last day in that department, and young Shonhan is surprised she knows. With a gentle smile, he reassures her, saying he's not going far, just to another department in the same hospital. The elderly patient compliments the intern's hands, saying they are so soft that the blood draw doesn't hurt at all. As he preps her arm, the guy from Owoon promises it will be quick and painless. As always, with impressive precision, he hits the lady's vein on the first try. Shin Seonhyun celebrates the success and then says the procedure is already over. The old woman then laments that he's leaving, as she had plans to marry him off to her granddaughter, and our protagonist plays along. She guarantees that her granddaughter is the spitting image of her, and young Sonhan, curious, asks the girl's age. The old lady proudly replies that the girl is 11 years old and already knows her multiplication tables, putting the young man in an awkward spot while the other patients laugh. Leaving the room, a nurse praises him, saying he's gotten very good at drawing blood. She explains that you can tell an intern's talent for procedures right from their first rotation. The nurse is referring to all sorts of medical tasks, from the simplest to the most complex surgeries. According to her, skill in small tasks is the foundation for performing major surgeries, and it all starts in the internship. Awkwardly, our protagonist asks how he did in her opinion, and if he's at least average. With a smile and a thumbs up, she states that, honestly, he has the best hands she's ever seen on a doctor. The nurse finishes her praise by saying he's also great with patients and will surely be a good doctor in whatever field he chooses. Her words move him so much that he even pretends to cry, and she jokes that he's also good at being full of himself. As they walk down the hall, the nurse asks where he's going for his next rotation, and our protagonist prepares to answer. However, a voice calls him kid from the defunct university, and young Shonhan turns to see who it is. To his surprise, it was Kim Byum-soo, who was staring at him with a serious expression before offering him a drink. He then leads him to a break area with some vending machines. Kim the Cobra then hands him a can of coffee and asks the intern to follow him for a moment, and the young man thanks him. Completely confused, the resident asks if this is his last day in internal medicine, and young Shonhan confirms that his next rotation will be in emergency medicine. Hearing the answer, the older doctor grimaces and warns that the ER will be tough because it means dealing with some guy named Yeo Bong-chil. He then asks if the kid still plans to go into surgery, and our protagonist confirms his plan. The guy from Owoon panics, wondering how the news spread so fast, and realizes there are no secrets in that hospital. Kim Byum-soo then says that's good because if he had chosen internal medicine, the doctor would have destroyed him. Our protagonist gives a nervous laugh and jokes that after hearing that, internal medicine sounds quite appealing, but Kim the Cobra yells at him to get lost. After the strange conversation, the intern tosses the empty coffee can into a nearby trash can. Kim the Cobra then gives him one last piece of advice, to work hard in the other departments and not to embarrass him, since he was his first supervisor. With a faint smile, the intimidating doctor finally admits that the kid did well during that month. Young Seonan is absolutely beaming with the compliment and celebrates with a huge grin on his face. Our protagonist reflects that he never imagined developing this kind of relationship with the prickly Dr. Kim Byum-soo. From there, he heads to his new challenge of the emergency medical center. Faced with the new department, the guy from Elwoon already feels completely exhausted before even starting. A total of 8 interns were assigned to the emergency room, and they must work in 24-hour shifts, divided into groups of 4. However, to young Seonhan's misfortune, he soon discovers that his team is the real problem. The first member of his group to appear is Oh Jung-won, the most senior intern and known for being a major slacker from Yeongguk University. To complete the dream team, the useless Jo Jin-ji is also on the team, and to make matters worse, his hand is in a cast. Our protagonist is completely devastated and wonders why, of all the people in the hospital, they had to be on his team. Oh Jung-won starts scolding Jo Jin, saying that of all places to get hurt, he had to break his hand. With a mocking smile, the injured guy explains that he'll have to stay like this for a month and therefore won't be able to do any heavy lifting. The lazy colleague gets annoyed and says that if he can't work, the others will have to do his job for him, but Jo Jin-ji replies that he'll handle the consent forms. Shin Seonan panics as the emergency department is already famous for being extremely difficult, and with an injured team member, the situation has become a full-blown catastrophe. Oh Jung-won then asks our protagonist what they should do, and the guy from Ilwoon replies that they just need to work hard. The lazy intern stares at him with a strange expression and says he's trusting everything to him, leaving young Shonhan completely confused. To our protagonist's despair, his 2 colleagues lean on him and declare him the team's ace, saying they're counting on him to carry the team on his back for the entire month. The guy from Ilwoon thinks this is not good at all, as he's always had bad luck with group projects since college. Suddenly, as he asks to pass, he gets a shock when he sees a giant hamster dressed as a doctor right in front of him. Confused, the intern rubs his eyes hard, thinking he's hallucinating from exhaustion. But when he looks again, he realizes it wasn't a hamster but a girl with short hair and a serious expression. The other colleagues greet her cheerfully and reveal that her name is Ham So, damn, and that she's also on their team. The girl then bows formally to introduce herself to the rest of the team. Oh, Jung. One then explains to our protagonist that she is royalty at Yangguk University, leaving the guy completely confused. He continues his explanation, saying that her entire family, since her grandfather, are professors at their medical school. Because of this, all the professors at the hospital know her and treat her specially. At that moment, Oh Jung-won shows 2 bags full of drinks that he bought for everyone. With a smug smile, the lazy colleague explains that he bought bread and drinks to please the professors, and that this is what social skills are all about. Our protagonist then tries to be nice and offers one of the drinks to his colleague Ham So damn. The girl looks up from her phone and stares at him for a brief moment, and then she turns her back and completely ignores him, leaving the guy from Ilwoon speechless. Faced with the situation, he reflects on the contrast between them. After all, she is hospital royalty while he came from a defunct university. Our protagonist sighs deeply, wondering how he's gonna survive with these team members. Suddenly, the door to the room opens slowly. From there, a tired-looking man enters the room and introduces himself as Yeo Bong-kil, the third-year resident in emergency medicine. With that, the entire team of interns bows in respect and greets him. The resident grumbles, wondering when they'll send him decent people, but then formally introduces himself. He then tells them to follow him as he will explain how the emergency room works. As they walk, he asks a strange question, wondering if they know what apocalypse means. The lazy colleague nervously replies that it's like the end of the world, with fire falling from the sky and the gates of heck opening. With a satisfied smile, Yeo Bong-kil says he knows it very well. Faced with the situation, he opens the emergency room doors and shouts that this place is exactly that. Upon seeing the scene, the interns are completely terrified by the chaos they find. The emergency room is total madness, with relatives shouting and patients being rushed in. A man is sick on a gurney while a desperate mother pleads for help for her injured son. The 4 newbies are frozen, not knowing what to do in the middle of so much confusion. With a sinister smile, the resident welcomes them to the apocalypse of emergency medicine. The 4 interns are completely paralyzed, with expressions of pure terror on their faces. Even though it's early morning, the ER is already packed with various patients, like a college student complaining of abdominal pain. Besides her, there's a 50-year-old woman with severe constipation and an office worker in his 30s vomiting from dizziness. And to complete the patient list, an elementary school boy was bitten by the neighbor's dog, and a foreign worker injured his fingers at a construction site. The guy from Ilwoon realizes that the scene is completely different from the internal medicine ward, as here, each patient has a different symptom. Faced with the chaos, resident Yeo Bong-kil looks at them and asks if they know what an emergency room is for. The lazy colleague hesitantly replies that it's to treat patients in serious condition, which is the obvious part of the answer. Yeo Bong-kil then explains that the function of the ER is to treat the most urgent patients first and then refer them to the appropriate departments. Thus, he emphasizes that in emergency medicine you need to be good in all clinical areas. The resident shouts, asking if they understood, and the whole group responds in unison. Heis. With that, the doctor tells them to get to work and leads them into the chaos. They then approach the first patient, and Yeo Bong-kil asks if her stomach hurts a lot. He then asks the girl to bend her knees and begins to examine her belly to locate the pain. The patient cries out in pain but manages to explain that it seems to be only in the upper part of her abdomen. After some tests, the resident informs the interns that the X-ray, ultrasound, and blood test showed nothing abnormal. Based on this, he concludes that it's probably not appendicitis but gastritis. While the other interns take notes, the doctor then advises her to come back immediately if the lower right part of her abdomen starts to hurt, as that could indeed be appendicitis. He then explains to the newbies that they must quickly assess patients' symptoms and that simple cases like this will be their responsibility. He then turns to the woman with constipation and says she will need an enema and that otolaryngology will take a look at her ear. Examining the boy bitten by the dog, Yeo Bong-kil reassures him, saying that luckily the bite wasn't too deep. To the foreign worker, he explains slowly that the wound is a bit deep and that plastic surgery will stitch it up, but it won't affect the function of his fingers. Shin Seonhan is completely amazed by the resident's ability to handle cases from internal medicine, surgery, and plastics so quickly and efficiently. Our protagonist is in awe of the imposing presence of a third-year emergency medicine resident, who seems like a god with multiple arms. Yeo Bong-kil then gives one last instruction to the team of interns. He then points to a monitor displaying a gigantic work list for them, and Young Seon-han is shocked by the amount of tasks. With a mocking smile, the resident jokes that they must be happy with so much work and that in the ER, not causing trouble is enough to be considered average. He then divides the tasks and sends our protagonist and his colleague Ham So-dam to help orthopedics and thoracic surgery, while the others take care of the list. And so the busy workday continues at Yeongguk University Hospital. After a long time, our protagonist finally gets a break for lunch. However, he is completely exhausted after a whole morning of tending to wounds, drawing blood, running tests, and calling other departments. He despairs at the thought of having to endure this pace for 24 hours straight and realizes the ER is truly a battlefield. Soon after, he spots his colleague Ham So-dam sitting alone at one of the cafeteria tables. The girl eats in a very peculiar way while scrolling on her phone, completely oblivious to what's happening around her. With that, our protagonist sits at the same table with her and comments that she was quick to get there despite the morning rush. Without even looking up from her phone, the girl replies with a simple, curt "Kais." The atmosphere becomes completely awkward, and the guy from Ilwoon doesn't quite know what to do or say. He then tries to cheer himself up, thinking it's just the first day and that they'll get closer over time, and at least he got to eat in the cafeteria instead of instant noodles. Meanwhile, his colleague Ham So-dam continues her meal without showing any emotion or interest in the conversation. Our protagonist realizes she's the hard-to-approach type, but decides he needs to try to be friendlier since they'll be working together for a month. So, in an attempt to break the ice, he offers her one of his shrimp tempuras, but the girl rejects the offer bluntly and without hesitation. With that, the distance between the two becomes even more apparent, creating a super weird vibe at the table. Not giving up, the intern tries to start another conversation and asks about her previous rotation and if she knows Dr. Kim the Cobra, but the girl responds curtly and rudely. The guy from Ilwoon is left completely speechless by his colleague's lack of interest, and the awkward silence returns to the table. In a last-ditch effort to connect, he comments that internal medicine was fun, but the ER is even cooler because of the variety of patients. Suddenly, the girl slams her phone on the table, leaving our protagonist completely shocked by the unexpected reaction. With an expression of pure rage, his colleague Ham So-dam asks what exactly he finds fun about it. The guy from Ilwoon is completely speechless as she vents about how horrible it is to be stuck in the ER for 24 hours without seeing daylight. The girl then stands up abruptly and shouts again, asking how this could possibly be fun. She continues her complaint, saying they have to deal with all sorts of bodily fluids from patients, and that for any little mistake, they get yelled at or even assaulted. Faced with the situation, our protagonist asks if she doesn't like being a doctor, and the girl explodes, saying she hates it and finds patients disgusting. To her, the emergency room is the worst place of all, and she recalls an incident that happened at the hospital a few years ago. The colleague tells the story of a drunk patient who suddenly assaulted an intern, and the guy was so traumatized that he quit his medical career. She then asks if that isn't scary, and young Seon-han agrees that the situation is quite frightening. After calming down a bit, the girl sits down and vents that she doesn't understand why people are so desperate to become doctors. Because of this, our protagonist gets curious and asks why she became a doctor, and her answer surprises him. Ham So-dam reveals that she only pursued the career because her parents told her to, and Shin Seon-han is shocked to learn that was the only reason. The guy from Ilwoon realizes she has lived in a completely different world from his, who fought tooth and nail to become a doctor. He reflects that there are many people who become doctors without a calling, just because they have good grades, or because they were pressured by their parents and ended up spending their childhood and college chasing a dream that wasn't their own. His colleague finishes by saying she has no talent for dealing with patients and just wants to finish her internship to move to a field where she no longer has to see them. Suddenly, a strange noise comes from his colleague Ham So-dam, and her hair covers her entire face. Soon after, the girl lets out a huge sigh of relief, as if a weight has been lifted from her shoulders, leaving the guy from Ilwoon even more confused. The colleague then points to our protagonist's food and asks if she can try a piece. The girl then reminds him that he had offered her a tempura earlier. Young Seon-han reminds her that she refused the offer before, but the girl replies with a pleading look that, upon second glance, the dish looks really tasty. Faced with her change in attitude, our protagonist gives a little smirk. He then plays along and says it's too late to change her mind, while the girl calls him stingy, but the guy from Ilwoon reveals it was just a joke and hands her the bowl, and she thanks him happily. The colleague then eats the tempura with relish, and our protagonist realizes that despite her unusual personality, the girl is very honest and direct. Thus, he feels relieved as he feels that in the end, they will be able to get along during the internship. Time passes and night falls over Yeongguk University Hospital. Elsewhere, resident Yeo Bong-chil is in his office, typing on the computer. He is filling out the first week evaluation form for the interns and starts with the guy with the injured hand, Jo Jin-ji, who isn't even worth evaluating. Next, he evaluates the lazy colleague, Oh Jung-won, saying that he is fast and has good skills but always takes shortcuts and slacks off at work. Finally, it's his colleague Hamso Dam's turn, and the resident sighs, as she is a headache for being hospital royalty. The doctor thinks her work ability is weak and that although she seems smart, she keeps making the same mistakes, perhaps due to a lack of confidence or not being suited for the profession. But he decides that it doesn't matter if she's a professor's daughter or the president's, the evaluation must be fair, so he gives her a C. Lastly, it's our protagonist's turn, and the resident admits he doesn't fully understand him yet, as he's doing better than expected. Yeo Bong Keel was worried about him being from a closed university, but his skills are better than most of Yeongguk's graduates, and what stands out most is his dedication. However, the guy from Owoon also doesn't stand out as an obvious elite, so his evaluation is a bit more complicated. Thus, the resident concludes that for now, the intern's evaluation is ambiguous, and the second week in the ER begins. At another time, our protagonist asks the lazy colleague if the 3 sets of blood cultures have been done yet. Oh Jung-won dodges the task, saying he needs to change a dressing and leaves the kits ready for Young Seon-han to do the work when he has time. The patient in question is an elderly woman, and the guy from Ilwoon already realizes it won't be easy to find a vein on her. He then accuses the lazy colleague of pushing the task on him on purpose, but the other just plays dumb and tells him to do the job. Suddenly, the intern with the broken hand comments that their colleague Hamso Dam has been gone for a while and wonders where she went. Soon after, a furious shout echoes down the hospital hallway, startling the 3 guys. They then spot an intimidating-looking man shouting and pointing aggressively at their colleague Hamso Dam. The girl is completely terrified by the situation, with tears streaming down her face, and completely frozen with fear she cowers, unable to react to the man's shouts. The furious man yells that she turned his father's arms into a pincushion, and that he can't understand how a doctor could fail for 20 minutes while the patient is burning up with a fever. Meanwhile, the intern with the broken hand comments that his colleague finally got herself into a mess, and that drawing blood should be an easy task for her by now. Arterial blood collection is one of the most common tasks for interns but also one of the trickiest, and it's normal for them to mess up and end up being yelled at by patients. Faced with the situation, the man loses his patience and yells for a nurse to come draw his father's blood. The nurse tries to explain that since it's an arterial blood test, the procedure must be done by a doctor, but the man gets even angrier and says that someone who can't even draw blood isn't a real doctor. With that, he raises his fist menacingly and shouts that he can't calm down and that he came to this hospital because of its good reputation but is now completely disappointed. Jo Jin-ji finds the whole scene pathetic and wonders what the point of being royalty is if she can't even do a simple procedure. Faced with the situation, our protagonist decides to intervene and runs towards the commotion. He approaches and says he will draw the blood in her place, leaving the man and his colleague completely surprised. The man then glares at him and asks if he's a doctor, and the guy from Ilwoon confirms with a smile. Soon after, Young Seon-han grabs a rolling chair to prepare for the procedure. As he approaches the patient, he apologizes and explains that it can be a bit harder to find veins in larger patients like his father. But the guy from Owoon quickly turns the situation around and says with a smile that he was actually thinking of his own father, who is also a big guy. However, this is a blatant lie, as our protagonist's father is actually quite thin. The truth is, arterial blood tests are not affected by physical build, and what the intern is doing is building a bond of trust with the patient and his companion. With that, Young Seon-han turns to the patient and, in a calm voice, asks him to sit up a bit, as this test is very necessary. The man's son gets angry and threatens the intern, saying he will tear the whole hospital down if he makes his father suffer again. The guy from Ilwoon tries to stay calm and assures him there's nothing to worry about, but inwardly he knows he's still a newbie and not perfect. He reflects that unlike his colleague, who spent her first rotation in pathology, he gained a lot of practical experience in internal medicine. To start the procedure, he asks the patient's son to press firmly on his father's right wrist to stop the bleeding. The man obeys without question and holds his father's wrist with gauze to stop the bleeding from where his colleague tried to puncture. Then, Young Seon-han adjusts the patient and asks him to stay as still as possible so the procedure can be quick. Looking at the man's arm, our protagonist understands the son's anger, as the wrist area is all bruised and unusable. Arterial blood gas collection is usually done by puncturing the radial artery in the wrist, which is deeper than the visible veins on the skin. Because of this, the doctor needs to feel the artery's pulse with their fingers to know exactly where to insert the needle. However, the patient's arm is so badly bruised that it's impossible to feel any pulse in that area. Faced with the problem, he realizes the only option is to look for a spot a little higher up the arm and wonders if he can get it on the first try. At that moment, he remembers the incredible skill of surgeon Song Ju, who seemed to have an ultrasound built into her fingers. The specialist managed to find a collapsed blood vessel without a second's hesitation during the ECMO procedure. With this inspiration, the guy from Owoon is filled with determination and tells himself he can't be the kind of doctor doctor, who fails to find a vein that's right under his fingers. The guy from Elwoon uses his fingers to feel the patient's arm and manages to feel a very faint pulse slightly above the bruise, which leads him to deduce where the artery should be. With that, he concentrates as much as possible, trying to find the exact location of the artery, and even mentally asks for it to appear. Suddenly, he finally feels the pulse very clearly, right under his fingers. Our protagonist mentally celebrates having finally found the exact spot for the puncture. He then warns the gentleman that it's going to hurt a little and asks him to hang in there for just a moment. The intern then inserts the needle very carefully, hoping the artery doesn't move. Meanwhile, the patient's son watches everything with an expression of pure tension, wondering if the young man is performing the procedure correctly. Shin Seonhan becomes apprehensive as the blood isn't entering the syringe as quickly as it should, and he questions if the artery is deeper than he thought. The tension in the air rises, and the patient's son starts to get irritated again, while Hamso-dam watches with concern. But suddenly, bright red blood starts to fill the syringe, and our protagonist lets out a sigh of relief for having succeeded. The collection is a success, and the syringe quickly fills with the necessary amount of blood for the test. After collecting the sample, the intern transfers it to an appropriate vial to be taken to the lab. With a satisfied smile, he announces that the procedure is already finished, leaving the patient's son completely shocked by the speed. The guy from Elwoon then jokes that they went through all that stress just to get a little bit of blood. The patient's son is impressed and comments that last time it hurt a lot, but with young Seonhan, he only felt the initial prick and didn't even notice the blood being drawn. The man is super impressed with the intern's skill and even tries to give him a tip, but the young man embarrassedly declines. To defend his colleague, he says that she is also a great doctor, but that everyone has bad days. With that, the mood lightens, and the patient's son feels relieved and thanks him for the good work. Suddenly, resident Yeobong, Chil comes running to the scene to see what was happening. He asks about the blood draw and says he even brought an ultrasound since the female intern couldn't find the vessel. Our protagonist informs him that he has already finished the procedure, leaving the resident completely surprised by the news. Yeobong Keel then asks how he managed to find the vessel, and the guy from Ilwoon explains that he felt for it by hand, shocking the doctor. Faced with the newbie's skill, the resident is impressed and admits that he's not bad at all. Despite the compliment, the doctor advises him to wait for the ultrasound next time, as it was luck that he got it on the first try. He then turns to his colleague Hamso-dam, who looks down, completely ashamed. The expression on the girl's face shows all her frustration and sadness for having failed the procedure. The resident lets out a long, tired sigh, not quite knowing what to do with the situation. So, he tells her to go to the restroom to cool her head and calm down a bit. The girl obeys and bows in respect before leaving the area, and with slow steps, the intern walks away towards the exit of the emergency center. Resident Yeobong Chil lets out a tired sigh and asks our protagonist to look after his colleague so she doesn't end up being treated as a malig. The word malig is short for malignancy, and among doctors, it's a derogatory term used to refer to someone with a bad reputation in the department. In other words, a colleague no one wants to work with, and being labeled as such is the worst thing that can happen to a professional in the field. At another time of day, a blue sky with white clouds adorns the hospital landscape. A girl who was on the ER's backup team drinks a yogurt and asks the guy from Ilwoon to take good care of her colleague Hamso-dam. The intern then finds the backup colleague sitting on a bench and comments that he feels bad just looking at Hamso-dam's situation. The girl then reveals that, to be honest, their colleague has been going through a tough time since college, as she was silently excluded by her peers. Our protagonist is surprised, as he imagined that being royalty, she would be super popular in college, but the backup colleague explains that this was exactly her problem. Because of her status, any little mistake she made was a reason for others to criticize her and embarrass her parents, and with that, she became increasingly shy. Young Seonhan understands the situation, as he knows that psychological pressure can make anyone mess up, and for someone with Hamso-dam's personality, the tendency is to shrink even more. He understands what the girl is saying but tries to dodge the responsibility, saying he can barely take care of himself. The guy from Ilwoon explains that he can help her a little, but in the end, everyone has to handle their own work. However, the backup colleague insists, saying she's worried because she fears Hamso-dam will make a big mistake. He then reflects on the possibility and concludes that as long as it's not a mistake that puts a patient's life at risk, the rest of the month should pass without major problems. He then tries to reassure her, telling her not to worry, as in just 1 month of internship, nothing too serious will happen. However, the moment he says this, his eyes suddenly widen. Unexpectedly, time stops and our protagonist finds himself alone on the same bench, but now on a dark and rainy night. With this, he is completely terrified and wonders if that strange feeling is starting again. Within his vision, a furious voice shouts, calling for all the ER interns. From there, he observes a group group of newbies lined up before a doctor in a completely dark place. The chief resident of the ER yells that in all his time working there, this is the first time something like this has happened. Faced with the scolding, all the interns in the vision look down, completely dejected and unresponsive. The doctor then gets straight to the point and announces that, to make a long story short, they will all receive a C for that month. Young Seonhan is completely shocked, as he can't believe he's going to get a C after just 2 months of internship. It hits him, and he realizes that such a low grade means this will be his last year at Yongguk University Hospital. Soon after, the chief yells at the interns in the vision, asking what on earth they did to deserve that. The scolding continues, with the senior doctor glaring at the group of newbies with pure contempt and disappointment. Desperate, our protagonist thinks it's impossible for everyone to get a C, as it means his career there is over, but the chief resident yells at them not to complain, because if one person messes up, it's everyone's responsibility, and they should have looked out for each other. The guy from Elwoon then wonders which of the 4 ER interns was responsible for causing such a serious accident. Inside the vision, resident Eo Bong Keel tries to apologize, but the chief shouts at him, saying it's not a mistake that can be prevented with teaching, and tells him not to protect anyone. The senior doctor puts his hand to his head, completely speechless at the possibility of a medical malpractice lawsuit from an intern. Hearing the word lawsuit, our protagonist is in shock, as he can't believe what he just heard. He then realizes this is the worst case scenario, as a mistake like this would turn the hospital upside down and wouldn't be solved with a simple apology. Facing the group of interns, the chief in the vision demands to know who was responsible for the accident, and young Seonhan panics, wondering if it was him. The senior doctor points accusingly while our protagonist desperately wants to know who is to blame for all of this. At the tensest moment, the vision ends abruptly, leaving Shin Seonhan completely in the dark. Back in reality, the intern lets out a scream of terror and throws his food in the air, startling his backup colleague, who was beside him. The girl is startled by his sudden reaction and asks why he's acting like that all of a sudden. Completely embarrassed, the guy from Elwoon apologizes and says it was nothing, trying to hide the panic he felt. He then puts his hands on his head, frustrated that the premonition ended like a K-drama cliffhanger without revealing who had caused the accident. The sign for the emergency medical center stands out, showing the location where the future disaster will occur. With a determined expression, our protagonist dedicates himself to observing everything around him. Back in the break room, he carefully watches his 3 teammates, wondering which of them will be responsible for the big problem to come. The guy from Ilwoon hides behind a folder and analyzes his 3 colleagues, wondering which one will be responsible for causing an accident. At that moment, the lazy colleague stretches and comments that at least the hospital is calmer since it's the weekend. Oh Jung-won then announces he's going to the echocardiogram room to rest for a bit and asks to be called if anything happens. Our protagonist takes the opportunity to ask if he did the lumbar puncture and if he got all 4 copies of the patient's consent form. With a smug smile, the lazy colleague tells him not to be so obsessive, and Young Seohan concludes that despite taking shortcuts, Oh Jung-won isn't the type to make mistakes in his own work. Soon after, the useless Jo Jin-ji shows up and tries to slack off with his colleague, but the other sends him away. As he watches the two walk away, the guy from the defunct university thinks that although Jo Jin-ji is a strong candidate for causing trouble, the chance of a medical accident is low since, with his hand in a cast, he's only doing simple tasks. After ruling out the other two, the most likely possibility falls on a single person. His colleague Ham So-dam, who is working silently at a computer, becomes the main suspect in the intern's mind. The guy from Elwoon watches her from a distance with a look of suspicion and concern. Suddenly, the girl approaches him and asks if they can talk for a bit, completely surprising the young man. On a quiet night in a hospital break area, the girl begins to open up, overlooking the city. She reminds him of the question he asked earlier about why she became a doctor. The colleague starts to share that since she was little, she was pressured by her parents to study and ended up going to medical school without ever thinking about what she really wanted to do with her life. She continues her vent, saying that now that she's a doctor, patients scare her and the work is very difficult, but her biggest fear is making a mistake while treating someone. The girl vents that she made 5 mistakes that day alone and feels like she became a doctor for nothing. Our protagonist understands her situation and realizes it's a classic case of a model student who has suffered from excessive pressure her whole life. With this conclusion, he is certain that the one responsible for the future malpractice lawsuit will be none other than Ham So-dam. He then reflects that if he does nothing, everyone will get a C, which would be disastrous for his career. Because of this, young Seonhan looks at her seriously and tells her not to worry alone. The girl is completely confused by his sudden comment. He continues, explaining that even if she makes a mistake, the other interns can help cover for her, and that she should use his and Oh Jung-won's help. With a gentle smile, the guy from Ilwoon proposes that they help each other to avoid mistakes, since they are all teammates. As the girl stares at him, he thinks that he's laying the groundwork and that if he can plant this idea in her head, he might be be able to prevent the fatal mistake. His colleague Ham So Dam then says that he is very kind, surprising young Shonhan with her reaction. With a slight blush on her face, she confesses that none of her colleagues have ever said anything like that to her, and that those words of support mean a lot. The intern feels a bit awkward and says that's natural among colleagues, while celebrating that he managed to break through her barrier. The girl then asks if he is kind because of his name Seonhan, which sounds like the word for kindness in Korean, and the young man is completely confused. He explains that his name doesn't have that meaning and that the character in his name actually means fresh fish, as he is the son of a sashimi restaurant owner. To his colleague's surprise, our protagonist reveals that his entire family has fish-related names, and that he is the only one who didn't follow the family business. The unusual story makes Ham So Dam burst out laughing uncontrollably. Our protagonist feels a bit awkward but realizes she's not as gloomy as he thought and is just insecure because it's the beginning of her internship. With this breakthrough, he feels relieved and believes that if things continue this way, he can avoid the worst case scenario he saw it in his premonition, and so a day begins at Yeongguk University Hospital. The conversation with the guy from Awoon seems to have completely changed the girl's attitude, who is now much more confident and smiley. As she walks down the hall, she reflects that Shin Seonhan's words were the first to give her confidence, as everyone at the hospital had always treated her with the prejudice of being royalty. Upon arriving at the ER, a nurse greets her and is surprised that she arrived so early for her shift. With a smile, the girl offers to help, and the nurse is even more surprised by her initiative. The nurse explains that there's a backlog of work and asks if she can see the patient in section B, and the girl promptly accepts the task. At the computer, the nurse informs her that it's a patient with urethral stenosis who had a relapse from last year's surgery and has been waiting for 20 minutes because the other doctors are busy. Reading the patient's name, Wang Jin Ho, the intern feels like she's heard that name somewhere before. The nurse explains that the first step is to drain the urine from his bladder and asks if the girl can perform a clean intermittent catheterization or if she needs to call another doctor. The procedure involves inserting a catheter through the urethra to drain urine and is common in patients with urethral or nerve problems who cannot empty their bladder on their own. The colleague becomes worried as she knows that 20 minutes is a long time for a patient in this condition and that his bladder must be full and painful, with the risk of bursting. The girl then remembers Shin Seonhan's words about helping each other and decides that to be useful, she needs to gain more experience with patients. With a determined smile, the girl accepts the responsibility and says she will do the procedure herself. From there, she prepares all the necessary materials for the catheterization. With the supply cart in hand, the girl heads to the patient's room with newfound confidence. Upon reaching area B7, she pauses for a moment to prepare herself. The colleague takes a deep breath and tries to calm down, reminding herself that she learned all of this in college and there's no reason to be nervous. With that, she pulls back the curtain, apologizes for the delay, and informs the patient that she will drain his urine. But upon seeing the patient, a young man with blonde hair and a celebrity-like appearance, she is completely shocked. The girl can't believe what she's seeing and is left completely speechless. The patient in question is none other than King Jino, a mega idol and global K-pop star. The intern is completely flushed and can hardly believe her luck at finding a K-pop star in the ER first thing in the morning. Suddenly, the young man calls her doctor, snapping her out of her trance. Completely desperate, the young man begs to be saved as his bladder is about to explode. The idol's image warps in her mind, and he appears as a desperate rapper singing about his bladder bursting. With the patient's shout, the girl finally returns to reality and tells herself to get it together, as he is just a patient who needs treatment. She then begins the procedure and asks how he is feeling, and the young man complains of a terrible pain in his stomach, explaining that he was fine after the surgery, but the problem has returned. With a confident smile, the girl informs him that the urologist will see him soon, but first, she will empty his bladder. The young man thanks her, embarrassed, and the intern asks him to take off his pants and lie on the bed. However, the moment he starts to undress, the colleague is completely shocked by the situation. Completely red in the face, she panics at the realization that a global K-pop idol is taking off his clothes right in front of her and tries to calm down, repeating that she is a doctor and he is just a patient. The young man then says he's ready, and the girl turns to begin the procedure, but upon seeing the young man lying on the gurney, the girl freezes and lets out an internal scream of pure despair. Completely embarrassed, she tries to convince herself that it's not King Gino but an elephant's trunk. The patient, with a pained expression, asks the doctor to hurry, as he can't hold it any longer. The intern then focuses her gaze on a specific spot to maintain her composure. Before her eyes, the print on the young man's underwear transforms into a friendly elephant, helping her concentrate on the task. The girl then prepares the catheter with a lubricating gel, thinking that the procedure is much easier than an arterial blood draw. She approaches the patient and warns him that it will feel a little cold. The young man then squeezes his eyes shut, feeling great discomfort as the procedure begins. However, the colleague notices that the catheter isn't going in properly, perhaps due to the patient's urethral stenosis condition. The girl then wonders if she used too much lubricating gel, as her hand is slipping. Frustrated with the difficulty, the girl tries to force the catheter in. With one last push, she finally celebrates having managed to insert the tube. Relieved, the girl believes she has passed the hardest part and prepares to press on the patient's abdomen to help the urine come out. However, she suddenly notices something moving and asks the young man not to move. To the intern's complete shock, the patient has an unexpected bodily reaction, and she lets out a scream of terror. Completely embarrassed, the idol apologizes to the doctor for the awkward situation. The girl panics when she realizes the Nelaton catheter is not where it should be. In a desperate delirium, she imagines the catheter going into an elephant's trunk, which lets out a bellow of pain. Our protagonist hears the scream and runs to the scene, completely confused by the situation. The lazy colleague tries to explain the bizarre situation involving Hamso Dam, the catheter, and the famous K-pop idol to him. Just describing the scene makes Oh Jung-won completely awkward and uncomfortable. He can barely finish the story because the situation was so absurd, covering his mouth to keep from laughing nervously. The guy from Ulwoon puts his hand on his head and thinks that, although crazy things happen in hospitals, this was something no one could have predicted. He then wonders how his colleague managed to lose control of the catheter in the middle of such a simple procedure. At the door of the room, his colleague Hamso Dam is seen talking to a serious-looking doctor about the incident. With her head down, his colleague Hamso Dam apologizes for the mess she caused. The older doctor reprimands her, explaining that urology patients can have involuntary bodily reactions and that she should have been prepared to use a special clamp. Awkward for having gone into detail, the doctor clears his throat and tries to hide his embarrassment. He finishes by saying that either way, she should have anticipated the situation, and the girl leaves while our protagonist watches from a distance. The lazy colleague then approaches and comments that the girl has rotten luck for deciding to come in early on that particular day. Oh Jung-won explains that she showed up an hour before her shift, and all this chaos happened while she was trying to get a head start on work that wasn't even hers. It dawns on the guy from Ulwoon, and he realizes that his encouragement for her to be more proactive might have been the trigger for the disaster. Completely frustrated, he pulls his own hair as he thinks that his attempt to prevent a medical accident ended up causing another one. The intern then asks about the patient's condition, and his colleague informs him that the urology team is already removing the catheter in an operating room. Oh Jung-won shakes his head in disbelief and says the situation is a complete disaster because she lost a catheter inside none other than King Gino. With this, our protagonist panics and asks if the famous idol is going to sue the hospital over the mistake. The lazy colleague says he thinks it's unlikely, as the removal is a simple procedure, and he heard that King Gino himself was apologizing for his body's reaction. Besides, he jokes that a global idol would never sue for this because the moment the news leaked, he would become famous as the Shrethra rapper. Shin Seon-han lets out a sigh of relief at the news, but is still worried about the whole situation until he hears a notification sound. The sound continues, and they realize it's the useless Jo Jin-ji casually scrolling on his phone in the middle of all the chaos. Oh Jung-won asks why the useless colleague is so cheerful, and Jo Jin-ji, with a malicious smile, reveals that he's live streaming everything in the group chat for the other colleagues, who are loving the catheter disaster. At that exact moment, our protagonist's phone starts vibrating non-stop in his lab coat pocket. When he takes out his phone, he sees a flood of messages from his friends Yeon Seo and Jun Wook asking if the story about the accident with King Gino is real. With a sigh of frustration, the guy from Ilwoon blames himself, realizing that all this chaos started because of the stupid things he said to her. Elsewhere, So Dam calls herself an idiot and cries huddled up, cursing herself and saying she's someone who should never have become a doctor. Shin Seon-han finds her and, with an awkward smile, tries to console her, telling her not to blame herself so much, as it's a mistake anyone could make. But the girl cuts him off and tells him not to worry about her anymore, surprising the young man with her response. With a defeated expression, the intern explains that she will just finish her internship without drawing attention and then choose a field where she no longer has to see patients. Not knowing what to say, young Seon-han insists that she shouldn't blame herself and should just make sure not to make the same mistake again. But the girl doesn't listen and continues to cry, saying she doesn't care because her career is already ruined. Faced with the situation, the guy from the defunct university realizes that words won't work and that from this point on, he will have to monitor her closely 24 hours a day. With a determined smile, he offers her his phone number and tells her to call anytime she needs help, as he will come running to her rescue. His colleague Hamso Dam is completely surprised and asks why he is doing so much for her, as he is too kind. Our protagonist panics and backs away, thinking that if she makes another mistake, his career will be over too. If he wants to survive at Yeongguk, he must prevent the lawsuit he saw in his dream at all costs. Meanwhile, far from the hospital, a heavy rain falls on a winding road in the middle of nowhere. A black luxury car speeds down the road in the downpour. Inside the vehicle, a group of 4 young people are having reckless fun, with one of them commenting that the roar of a Bentley is really different. One of the friends asks if it's okay to take his father's car, and the driver replies that the old man has so many cars he won't even notice one is missing. The girl in the back seat gets worried and asks if the driver even has a license. The other 2 guys mock her and ask what kind of high school student would have a license. One of them then encourages the driver to step on it to see how fast the car can go. With a smug smile, the young man at the wheel agrees and prepares to accelerate. The luxury car speeds down the road at an absurd speed in the heavy rain. The driver then starts weaving between other cars in a completely reckless manner. The girl screams in fear, begging him to slow down, but the guy tells her not to worry because people get out of the way when they see an expensive car. Ignoring the danger, the car continues to accelerate more and more down the highway. Back at Yeongguk University Hospital, the rain continues to fall heavily. Through the window, a man watches the storm and wonders why it's raining so much all of a sudden in the spring. Our protagonist approaches with a tray, and the man asks if he hasn't seen the heavy rain outside, lamenting that all the cherry blossoms will fall. With a smile, the guy from Ulwon replies that he's been stuck in the ER for so long he had no idea what the weather was like. At this, the man sighs and laments the intern's poor youth, not even knowing if spring has arrived or if the flowers have bloomed. At that moment, Oh Jung-won and the guy with the broken hand arrive with bags, offering cold drinks to everyone. The lazy colleague opens a can and hands it to the man, who is overjoyed as he was very thirsty. The senior intern then passes him the orange soda, but upon taking the first sip, the man makes a face of pure disgust at the taste of the drink. With that, he explodes in anger and shouts, asking why on earth they brought that specific soda, which brings bad luck to the ER. At that, the lazy intern remembers the superstition and completely panics. The man then blames them, saying that if the ER gets flooded with patients, it will be all their fault. Suddenly, the reception phone starts ringing amidst the chaos. A nurse answers the call and identifies herself as being from the Yeongguk Hospital Emergency Center. Her expression changes upon hearing the news of a traffic accident on the other end of the line. The nurse then asks for the location and estimated time of arrival, while the entire medical team listens intently. Without wasting a moment, the man prepares for action as a new emergency is on its way. Resident Yeo Bong-chil takes the phone from the nurse and asks about the condition and number of patients from the accident. The doctor's expression becomes completely serious as he listens to the information from the other side. He then repeats in shock that the number of victims is 7. From there, chaos erupts in the hospital, and the ER phones start ringing off the hook. Faced with the situation, the entire team of interns is on high alert, awaiting the arrival of the injured. Our protagonist has an expression of pure terror as he realizes the gravity of what is to come. The can of cursed soda remains on the table like a bad omen that the superstition was real. On the road, the accident scene is a complete disaster, with an overturned truck and several rescue vehicles working under torrential rain. It all started with the reckless driver dangerously weaving between other cars. The girl next to him was screaming in fear, begging him to slow down, but the guy paid her no attention. The luxury car continued to accelerate uncontrollably on the wet road. In the midst of her desperation, the girl realizes they are in the wrong lane and screams in terror at the driver, but the young man at the wheel just gives a malicious smile, completely out of his mind. With a maniacal laugh, he presses even harder on the accelerator in an act of pure madness, and in a fraction of a second, the luxury car comes face to face with a huge truck heading towards them, sealing the fate of everyone inside. In the back seat, one of the guys completely panics at the sight of the imminent collision. The truck driver desperately tries to swerve, but it's too late. The head-on collision is unavoidable, and a deafening sound echoes down the highway. With the impact, the truck overturns and other cars try to brake to avoid a pile-up, but the wet road causes a chain reaction, and several vehicles crash into each other. The luxury car is thrown by the force of the crash. Meanwhile, another car flips violently in the middle of the road. The reckless youth's vehicle finally comes to a stop after hitting the guardrail hard. The car door opens with difficulty amidst the chaos. The driver gets out of the vehicle, still in shock from the gravity of what just happened. His friends also get out of the car, completely dazed and complaining of pain. One of them comments that they only survived because they were in a Bentley, and the other says he really thought they were going to be goners. Suddenly, the girl calls them and points to the scene of destruction they caused on the road. The highway has turned into a veritable war zone, with wrecked cars and people crying for help in desperation. And inside one of the overturned cars, a person is trapped in the wreckage, severely injured. Through the wreckage of one of the overturned cars, an arm can be seen under the heavy rain. Faced with the scene of destruction, the girl in the group of youths is completely shocked and realizes they are screwed. Her friends also panic, not knowing what to do in the middle of all that chaos. One of them then desperately shouts at the driver, asking what they are going to do now. The young man at the wheel just looks at the wrecked luxury car and laments that his father will surely kill him for this. But unfortunately for them, the sirens of the police and ambulances are already echoing down the road, getting closer and closer. On the ground, an empty liquor bottle reveals the true cause of the youth's recklessness. Back at Yeongguk University Hospital, the news of an accident caused by drunk minors spreads quickly. Faced with the situation, a senior doctor explodes with anger, saying that today's youth seem to have a wish to pass on. He then asks Yeo Bong-cheol for the number of victims, and the resident confirms there are 7, but thankfully, none require resuscitation. Our protagonist tenses up, knowing that with so many serious patients arriving at once, the chance of a medical error is extremely high. The lazy colleague, Oh Jung-won, on the other hand, sees the situation as a great learning opportunity, and the guy from Ilwoon believes he will be fine. As for his colleague Ham-so Dam, she continues to wear an expression of pure worry, still shaken by everything that happened. Young Seon-han then wonders about the useless Jo Jin-ji, but another doctor explains that with his hand in a cast, he will only handle the paperwork. Our protagonist lets out a sigh of relief, thinking it's better not to have someone who might freak out and cause trouble at such a critical moment. Suddenly, the sound of sirens echoes throughout the hospital, and the medical team braces for impact. Soon after, paramedics flood the ER, bringing in the first injured person while someone shouts that 11 patients from the accident have just arrived. The senior doctor is completely shocked, as he thought there were only 7 and wonders why they sent 4 more victims there. A nurse panics and reports that there are already more than 10 patients waiting for treatment, and they don't know what to do. With that, Yeo Bong-cheol orders her to apologize and ask the non-urgent patients to wait, then calls the interns to follow him. He then asks about the victims' conditions, and one of the paramedics informs him that most are between levels 3 and 5, with a possible level 2 patient. The resident shouts that the accident scene was chaotic, so the triage might be wrong, and if a level 1 patient shows up, they should be taken directly to the resuscitation room. In emergencies, patients are classified by severity, with levels 4 and 5 for minor pain or simple care. Levels 3 and 2 are for more serious cases like moderate breathing difficulty, major trauma, or high fever. Suddenly, a gurney is rushed in while someone yells that a level 1 patient has just arrived, and one of the doctors gets annoyed because they were told it was level 2. Level 1 is the most critical of all, involving cardiac arrest, shock, or unconsciousness, and must be treated above all else. Faced with the gravity of the situation, the interns have expressions of pure terror, and one even lets out a gasp of shock. Without wasting a moment, Yeo Bong-cheol yells to take the patient immediately to the resuscitation room. Inside, the resident asks about the girl's condition, and the paramedic explains that when they arrived, she was already semi-conscious and had lost a lot of blood. He finishes by saying they managed to control the initial bleeding, but that there are definitely other sources of internal hemorrhage. With that, the medical team places a blood pressure cuff on the patient's arm to check her vital signs. Soon after, a sensor is placed on her finger to measure the oxygen level in her blood. Yeo Bong-cheol looks at the monitor and shouts that although the EKG is normal, her saturation and blood pressure are very low and orders them to prepare for intubation. Then, the resident turns to our protagonist and his colleague Ham-so Dam and tells them to find the source of the bleeding as quickly as possible, and they both agree. The most important thing to keep an emergency patient alive is to ensure oxygen, and the second is to preserve blood, so the team cuts the girl's clothes to look for injuries. Young Seon-han tenses up, knowing that every second is crucial, as for every minute delay in stopping the bleeding, the chance of survival drops by 3%. Thus, the team needs to find the exact point of hemorrhage as quickly as possible amidst so much blood spread across the victim's body. Yeo Bong-cheol impatiently asks if he has found anything yet, and our protagonist frantically replies that he is still looking. The patient is already on a breathing tube, and the pressure in the room is immense, making it difficult to stay calm and think clearly. Suddenly, his colleague Ham-so Dam shouts that she has found the wound, leaving the guy from Ilwoon completely surprised by the discovery. She then points to a large cut on the patient's left arm that is bleeding non-stop. With the wound located, Yeo Bong-cheol orders them to apply pressure immediately to stop the hemorrhage while the entire team gathers around the patient. Our protagonist watches his colleague and notices that her movements are quick and precise, and he wonders if deep down she is strong in major crisis situations. One of the doctors uses a penlight to check the patient's pupils and confirms that they seem to be normal. Faced with the situation, the senior doctor says he will check the ultrasound and grabs the device to examine the patient. After the exam, the senior doctor informs them that the ultrasound showed nothing obvious and that there is no blood accumulated in the cavities of the heart, abdomen, or chest. Yeo Bong-kil then turns to Oh Jung-won and shouts, asking if the arterial blood gas results are back yet, and the lazy colleague stammers that he is doing it now. The older doctor also gets annoyed and scolds him for being so slow, asking if he's going to finish the test after the patient has already passed. Our protagonist watches the scene and wonders what's wrong with his colleague, as even though it's his first time with a patient bleeding so much, his reaction is over the top. Seeing that the lazy intern has completely frozen, Yeo Bong-kil shoves him aside and says he will insert an arterial line himself. The arterial line is a plastic tube inserted into an artery to monitor blood pressure and perform repeated blood tests, and after collecting the sample, the resident hands it to Oh Jung-won and tells him to run to the lab. Completely terrified, the lazy colleague takes the syringe with trembling hands. However, the pressure is so great that his hands shake uncontrollably, and he ends up dropping the blood sample on the floor. But in a swift move, our protagonist dives and manages to catch the syringe in mid-air before it shatters on the floor. The guy from Oh-woon ends up on the floor but manages to save the blood sample, surprising everyone with his reflex. Yeo Bong-kil explodes with anger at the lazy intern and yells at him to get it together, while the young man just apologizes. Shin San-han realizes the situation is terrible, as in that state of panic, it wouldn't be surprising if his colleague made an even bigger mistake. Oh Jung-won then turns to our protagonist and asks him to hand over the syringe. The guy from Oh-woon looks at his colleague's expression of pure terror and realizes that he's good at taking shortcuts but terrible under pressure, and the scalding has sent him into a total panic. Determined to resolve the situation, he stands up and says he will take the sample for testing, asking his colleague to watch the bleeding in his place. Our protagonist thinks that he needs to prevent any mistakes that day, and to achieve that, he knows he will have to work even harder. A short time later, the test results finally come in. The guy from Il-woon hands the papers to the senior doctor, who analyzes them with an expression of pure worry. He is shocked to see that the hemoglobin is only at 6.8 and that the red blood cell count is dangerously low. The senior doctor then explains that a low red blood cell level is a sign of hidden bleeding, and our protagonist concludes that the patient has an internal hemorrhage. Hearing the news, Yeo Bong-kil realizes there is another source of bleeding besides the visible wounds. The situation is extremely serious because, since it can't be seen with the naked eye, internal bleeding is much harder to detect. Meanwhile, the patient remains unconscious and intubated, completely unaware of the danger she is in. Internal hemorrhage is a nightmare for doctors, as it's like looking for a needle in a haystack, but with someone's life on the line. With the girl's life hanging by a thread, the medical team enters a desperate race against time to find and stop the bleeding before it's too late. Faced with the urgency, the senior doctor orders them to administer a lighter of plasma while Yeo Bong-kil shouts to call the blood bank and order a portable X-ray. A technician quickly arrives with the portable X-ray equipment, and the resident instructs him to take X-rays of the cervical spine, chest, and pelvis as quickly as possible. The technician positions the machine and asks everyone to step back to avoid radiation exposure. However, Yeo Bong-kil explodes at the technician and yells at him to take the X-rays right away because the patient is about to pass, and there's no time to worry about radiation, telling the nurses and interns to leave the room. Our protagonist then reflects that in normal situations, everyone should wear protective gear or step away during an X-ray to avoid radiation exposure. Resident Yeo Bong-kil notices something strange. He then turns and shouts at Shin San-han, asking why he didn't leave the room, and our protagonist calmly replies that it's okay. With a confident smile, the guy from Il-woon jokes that you get radiation even on a plane flight and that the resident should consider this a trip to Jeju Island. Yeo Bong-kil gives an awkward smile and wonders if that's really the same thing. Despite the joke, the priority now is to preserve every drop of blood leaking from the patient's body, and our protagonist isn't doing this out of a sense of duty or sacrifice. To him, this is just total immersion, as the intern just wants to focus on what needs to be done at that exact moment. The resident stares at him in silence with a serious expression on his face. Suddenly, a beep sounds through the room, and the technician announces that the imaging exam is complete. The senior doctor then approaches the machine and begins to analyze the newly taken X-rays. As he looks at the images, his eyes widen as he has finally found the problem. He then points to the screen and shouts that the problem is in the pelvis, leaving the entire team completely surprised. The X-ray shows that the patient's pelvis was fractured and twisted from the impact of the accident, and in cases like this, internal bleeding can reach 2,000 milliliters. Upon the discovery, the senior doctor orders them to get a pelvic binder and contact orthopedics immediately. With that, the medical team begins to apply the compression device around the patient's hips. The binder is then tightened firmly, compressing the pelvis to try and stop the internal bleeding. Thus, the medical team begins the transfusion of fluids and blood into the patient to stabilize her. At the monitor, Yeo Bong-cheol watches with relief as the girl's blood pressure finally starts to rise. The beeps of the heart monitor continue to echo through the room while the patient remains unconscious on the gurney. With that, the resident confirms that her pressure, pulse, and oxygen saturation are all within the normal range. The senior doctor then asks about the patient's consciousness, and our protagonist informs him that she has not woken up yet. The guy from Owoon approaches the gurney to check the girl's condition more closely. Suddenly, one of the patient's eyes slowly opens, leaving young Shaunhan completely surprised. With a big smile on his face, he excitedly shouts that he thinks the patient is regaining consciousness. The senior doctor lets out a sigh of relief and comments that they have finally passed the most critical point. Yeo Bong-cheol then asks if they should proceed with a CT scan, and the professor agrees, telling them not to forget to continue the transfusion. The older doctor instructs them to start with the brain and then do CT scans of the chest, abdomen, and pelvis, warning that he will check on the patients with minor injuries. Our protagonist leans against the wall, completely exhausted and relieved that no medical accidents occurred. He reflects that if his lazy colleague had caused an error due to panic, the delay in discovery could have endangered the patient's life. Faced with the situation, the intern realizes that they fortunately managed to treat the most critical patient safely, but he suddenly remembers that there are still 10 victims from the traffic accident to be treated. He knows he can't let his guard down until the night is over, so he runs back into the chaos. The ER is in complete madness, with patients screaming in pain everywhere. The place has turned into a veritable war zone, and with the arrival of doctors from orthopedics and neurosurgery, the ER becomes even more crowded. To make matters worse, the victims' families arrive in desperation, turning the place into complete chaos, and our protagonist finally understands that the ER is the true front line of the hospital. After a lot of work, our protagonist and his colleague Dam are dressing one of the patient's wounds and commenting on the rush. The guy from Ilwoon reflects that this day will surely go down in history, as he has never experienced anything so insane since he started his internship. His colleague then comments that this whole situation has been a wake-up call for her, and young Xianhan is surprised by her statement. The girl explains that seeing so many injured people arriving at the hospital, all her previous complaints and fears now seem completely ridiculous. He then praises her, saying she is doing very well, and without making mistakes, remembering how she quickly found the most critical patient's wound. The colleague then thanks him and says the credit is all his, as the words of support he gave her earlier helped a lot, leaving the young man completely confused. With a big smile on his face, he jokes and asks if she no longer hates seeing patients. The girl immediately denies it, saying she still hates it and that the whole situation still scares her a lot. But with a new determination in her eyes, she states that despite the fear, she has to do what needs to be done. Seeing her change in attitude, our protagonist gives a smirk and thinks that at least for today, he no longer needs to worry about his colleague Dam. Suddenly, a furious voice shouts, asking who is in charge there, leaving the two interns completely confused by the interruption. A furious man accompanied by a woman shouts, demanding to speak with the ER supervisor. Faced with the confusion, a nurse approaches the couple and asks what the problem is. The man accuses her of negligence with an expression of pure rage on his face. He then points to his son lying on the gurney and shouts, asking why he isn't being treated immediately. Next to our protagonist, the lazy colleague whispers that this is the unlicensed student who caused the accident and that according to the paramedics, he was barely injured. The intern is outraged to realize that these are the boy's parents and that even though he is the one at fault, he acts as if he has some right. The boy's father gets worked up and asks if they know who he is, threatening to sue everyone for negligence. The nurse tries to calm him down, saying that you can't shout in the ER, but the man retorts that his only son is in pain. The woman then chimes in, outraged to hear that there are more urgent patients at the moment. She continues the drama, saying that for people like the other victims, it doesn't matter if they are treated sooner or later, and that they should take care of the quicker cases first. Completely out of his mind, the man loses his patience and shoves the nurse hard, making her cry out in pain. Seeing the assault, the guy from Ilwoon desperately shouts for someone to call security. However, unexpectedly, someone tells them to stop. It was Dam, who was completely furious. She stands before the man like a hamster, ready to defend her companions. Our protagonist is completely shocked to see his colleague Dam's fury. The man glares at her with contempt and asks who she thinks she is. With surprising courage, the girl shouts that his son is not the only precious one there, leaving the man completely speechless. She then points to the other accident victims and says that all the injured people there are someone's precious children, and that one of them almost didn't make it due to blood loss. The colleague then gets straight to the point and reveals that all of this happened because of his irresponsible son, who is casually casually lying on the gurney. The couple is completely speechless at the accusation, and the girl continues, saying they should be on their knees. Apologizing, with impressive calmness, she informs them that their son will be treated shortly and asks them to wait their turn. The man turns completely red with anger, unable to believe the intern's audacity. Out of her mind, the woman raises her purse and tries to hit the colleague, shouting about how she dares to talk back like that. Our protagonist shouts his colleague's name in desperation upon seeing the imminent assault. But the girl is not intimidated and begins to cite Article 12 of the Emergency Medical Services Act. She then explains that anyone who assaults, threatens, or obstructs emergency medical personnel can be sentenced to up to 5 years in prison. The couple is completely paralyzed by the threat, and the girl stares at them with unwavering determination. The man gets angry and wonders what kind of hospital this is where a mere intern dares to threaten a guardian. The woman then gets worked up again and says she will file an official complaint against the colleague at Yongguk University Hospital. Unfazed, his colleague Ham So Dam tells the woman to file the complaint, leaving her completely surprised by the response. The girl then formally introduces herself as an intern at Yongguk University Hospital and states her full name. Her confident posture leaves the couple completely powerless in the middle of the crowded ER. The man then threatens her, saying he won't let this go, but the girl challenges him and tells him not to let it go, and to make sure to file the complaint against her. She then points to the exit and kicks them out of the treatment area, saying they are in the way and that their son will be seen when it's his turn. Our protagonist is completely amazed by his colleague's attitude and wonders if she always had this brave side. Worried, he approaches her and asks if she will be okay, as the man seemed like he would actually file the complaint. The girl then states that in her entire life, she has never backed down just because of connections, and young Xiaonan finally understands the true dignity of Yongguk's royalty. With an exaggerated gesture, he congratulates her while his colleague stares at him, completely confused. Suddenly, resident Yeobong Chil appears with an expression of pure rage. Completely irritated, he shouts, asking what all the shouting in the ER is about, as there are patients everywhere. The girl bows an apology before her superior's scolding. Impatiently, the resident lightly pushes her and tells her to get back to her patients. But as he turns his back, he gives the intern a discreet thumbs up with a smirk, praising her attitude. With a pat on the backs of the two interns, Yeobong Chil yells at them to get a move on, as there is still a mountain of work to be done. His colleague Ham So Dam gives a faint smirk at the situation. Our protagonist looks at her and smiles back with a sense of pride and admiration for her courage. Time passes and night falls over Yongguk University Hospital. On a tray, a forceps holds a piece of blood-soaked gauze after cleaning a wound, and the doctor announces that the procedure is finished. Yeobong Chil then discharges some of the patients with minor injuries, and they thank him for the care. As they walk down the hall, the resident asks Shin Xiaonan if all the accident patients have been treated, and the guy from Ulwoon confirms the work is done. Our protagonist comments that the hospital is really dynamic and that he hadn't noticed this in the internal medicine ward. With a smirk, Yeobong Chil replies that of course it is, as an emergency room is called that for a reason. The resident explains that there, patients scream in pain, families demand faster treatment, and people who look like they're about to pass away arrive at any moment. But he continues, saying that there is a kind of thrill in the ER you don't find in other departments, and young Xiaonan is curious to know what it is. The resident then explains that saving a dying patient with your own hands and returning them to their family is something indescribable, and with a look full of pride, he states that changing people's destiny is the true pride of emergency medicine. His words echo in our protagonist's mind, who is completely amazed by the idea of changing destiny. Seeing the intern's reaction, Yeobong Chil grabs him by the shoulder and asks if he's interested and invites him to bet his career there. With a humble smile, our protagonist replies that he would honestly be grateful to be accepted anywhere. He adds that it would be an honor to work with Dr. Yeo, and that he will seriously consider the proposal. The resident doesn't like the flattery at all and slaps the young man on the back, shouting that's enough, while the intern grumbles that he was being serious. Soon after, Yeobong Chil tells him to hurry up and see the rest of the patients, as he is very behind, and the guy from the defunct university agrees. After the storm has passed, the ER somehow seems strangely peaceful, but young Xiaonan feels a sense of unease, as if he has forgotten something important in the midst of all the chaos. From there, he spots his lazy colleague Oh Jung, one working at a computer, and calls out to him. The guy from Ulwoon explains that since they've finished the accident cases, they can split up to take care of the regular patients, and his colleague thanks him for saving his life. Oh Jung one then comments that Jo Jin Ji saw several other patients while they were handling the accident cases, leaving our protagonist completely confused. He is intrigued, as he thought the young man couldn't do anything because of his injured hand. The lazy colleague explains that the useless one recovered faster than expected and has already had his cast removed, and we see Ji stretching happily. Oh Jung, one explodes with anger and accuses him of taking it easy while they were almost dying, but the other defends himself, saying he worked hard since the cast came off. At that moment, our protagonist finally understands what that bad feeling was, as he was so focused on the accident patients that he didn't even think about those who were already there. Thus he realizes that the problem wasn't Ham So Dam or Oh Jung Won, but the useless Ji. Meanwhile, the young man's hands are working frantically at a keyboard, indicating that something is very wrong. Our protagonist then checks the task list and realizes that although Ji handled several cases, none of them seem particularly risky. But upon seeing a specific procedure on the list, his eyes widen in pure shock. The procedure in question is a thoracentesis, where a needle is inserted into the chest to drain excess fluid from around the lungs. This is not an extremely difficult procedure and can be performed by an intern, and the patient was a 70-year-old man with shortness of breath. Without wasting a moment, he approaches Ji and asks directly if he made any mistakes today, and the young man stares at him, completely confused. The useless intern gets annoyed and asks why he's picking a fight out of nowhere, but our protagonist insists it's just a precaution. With that, Jin boasts that he has been called an ace several times and tells Shin Seonhan to mind his own business. Our protagonist then asks if he took an X-ray after the procedure, and the other irritably replies that he obviously did. However, he soon admits that he hasn't checked the result yet, sending young Seonhan into a panic, who shouts that checking the X-ray after such a procedure is the bare minimum. The young man then gets worked up and shouts, asking if the other thinks he's the only one who worked hard, as he was also busy while they were taking care of the accident patients. With a bad feeling, the guy from Awoon senses that something is very wrong and yells at him to pull up the X-ray immediately. Complaining about his colleague's annoying persistence, Jai finally sits down at the computer to check the exam, but as he looks at the monitor screen, his expression changes completely, and he doesn't understand what he's seeing. The radiograph shows that the pleural effusion is still there, indicating that the procedure failed miserably. The useless intern comments that that's why almost nothing came out when he inserted the needle and suggests trying again, but our protagonist has a terrible epiphany upon seeing the image. Faced with the situation, young Seonan shouts in desperation and asks Jai if he doesn't see the problem in the image, but the young man just stares at him, confused. With that, our protagonist points to the radiograph and reveals that there is a giant pneumothorax on the opposite side of the fluid, leaving his colleague completely confused. It finally dawns on the useless intern, who turns completely pale and starts sweating profusely at the discovery. The guy from the defunct university explains that he clearly treated the right lung, but the left lung is the one with the pneumothorax. At this, our protagonist stares at him and asks with an expression of pure terror if he punctured the wrong lung. Ji is completely paralyzed and starts sweating buckets, unable to answer the question. Desperate, young Seonhan runs off and asks where the patient is, as puncturing the opposite lung means he punctured the only lung that was still working. However, before he can get far, the useless intern grabs him by the lab coat in an act of pure desperation. With that, the young man begs Shen Seonhan not to tell anyone, because if the news gets out, his evaluation for the month is toast. Our protagonist turns to him, completely shocked, unable to believe what he just heard. Ji continues his pathetic plea, saying that they are already looking at him funny because of his casted hand and asks them to cover up the case. Shin Seonhan's face darkens, and he asks with restrained fury what that scumbag just said. With a smile of pure panic, the useless intern suggests that since the pneumothorax is small, maybe they can just let it go. The absurd suggestion makes young Seonhan explode, and he calls him a crazy idiot with all his might. The argument happens right in the middle of the nurse's station, while the other staff continue to work, unaware of the time bomb about to go off. Our protagonist slams his hand on the table, completely irritated by his colleague's attitude. He shouts that his internship grade doesn't matter one bit, as the patient could perish because of that mistake. Young Seonhan glares at Ji with pure rage while the other intern is frozen with fear. He then grabs him and demands to know where the patient is, as 30 minutes have passed since the X-ray was taken. Without waiting for an answer, the guy from Ilwoon runs off desperately to find the man before it's too late. When they arrive at the room, they find the old man lying in bed with an expression of pure suffering. The man is gasping for air and can barely breathe properly, with his hand on his chest. With great difficulty, he calls for the doctor and says he can't go on, and completes the sentence by saying he can't breathe, putting the two interns on high alert. From there, the patient panics and begins to struggle desperately for air. The scene leaves the two young doctors completely terrified by the gravity of the situation. Our protagonist quickly checks the monitor and sees that the patient's oxygen saturation has dropped to 73%, a dangerously low level. He realizes that the monitor's alarm had been going off the whole time, but with the ER looking like a war zone, no one could hear hear it. Faced with the urgency, the guy from Ilwoon shouts to prepare an oxygen mask and runs to help the patient. As Shin Seon-hin springs into action to save the man, the useless Jo Jin-ji stays behind, completely frozen in shock. Our protagonist yells at Jo Jin-ji not to just stand there and to show the X-ray to Yeo Bong-cheol and call thoracic surgery. With the shout, the useless intern finally snaps out of it and runs out of the room while the guy from Ilwoon watches him. At that moment, it dawns on him, and he understands that this was the future he saw in his dream. As the patient struggles to breathe with the oxygen mask, our protagonist thinks that if they had been any later, the man would have been gone before they could do anything. He then tries to concentrate and think about what he can do in this situation, as the patient has a pneumothorax, which is when air accumulates in the chest. The only solution to get the lung to breathe properly again is to remove the air as quickly as possible, and the guy from Ilwoon concludes that the best option is a needle aspiration. So, he shouts for a nurse to bring him a 16-gauge needle, and the woman promptly obeys. Soon after, she hands him the necessary materials for the emergency procedure. Faced with the situation, the intern positions himself next to the patient, ready to begin the aspiration. However, as he holds the needle, he pauses for a moment, completely hesitant. The guy from the defunct university then wonders if he is really the right person to do this, as he has only learned about the procedure in books and has never performed it on a real patient. In his mind, he ponders whether he should wait for someone more experienced to arrive and help. He knows that if he decides to do the procedure on his own and makes a mistake, it will be very difficult to get a good evaluation that month, and in the worst case scenario, he could become the one responsible in a lawsuit, exactly as he saw in his premonition. But the sounds of the gasping patient bring him back to reality, reminding him that the man's life is on the line. Faced with the patient struggling for air, the guy from Ilwoon remains silent for a moment, weighing his decision. He then squints, determined not to let the man perish. With that, he realizes there is no more time, as in an elderly patient, any extra second in that state could be fatal. Young Seon-han knows that at best, thoracic surgery will take at least 10 minutes to arrive, and if he doesn't do something now, it will be too late. So, he remembers what he learned in the books and prepares to insert the needle above the nipple, along the upper edge of the rib. With impressive precision, he advances the needle, piercing the patient's skin. The man's body flinches with the prick, but our protagonist remains focused on the procedure. He realizes the needle is still too shallow and pushes it a little deeper. With a careful movement, the intern advances the needle to the correct depth. He then leans over the patient to check if the procedure is working. Suddenly, a sound of escaping air echoes through the room, indicating that he hit the spot. From there, the patient's breathing begins to normalize slowly, and with the pressure in his chest relieved, the man can finally breathe more calmly. Our protagonist looks at the monitor with a triumphant smile as he sees the oxygen saturation climb to 89. However, his thoughts are interrupted by a shout, and soon after, Yeo Bong-cheol's team bursts into the room on high alert. Upon arrival, Yeo Bong-cheol is on the phone and comments that the patient will probably need chest tubes on both sides. But he suddenly notices the needle sticking out of the man's chest and is completely shocked. Completely furious, the resident shouts Shin Seon-han's name and asks what on earth he just did. He then grabs him by the lab coat and scolds him for performing an emergency procedure on his own. However, upon looking at the monitor, the doctor is shocked to see that the patient's oxygen saturation has risen. Without wasting a moment, he asks a nurse to bring him a syringe and a valve, and the woman promptly hands them over. The team then moves the patient, and the doctor tells our protagonist to hold the valve firmly. From there, Yeo Bong-cheol begins to use the syringe to aspirate all the air that was trapped in the man's chest. Our protagonist watches the procedure very attentively alongside his superior. After stabilizing the patient, the resident approaches and asks how he is feeling at the moment. The gentleman explains that his wife had stepped out for a moment, and suddenly he couldn't breathe anymore. The old man adds that he thought he was going to pass, and couldn't even call for help. With a gentle smile, Yeo Bong-cheol reassures him, saying he will be fine now and not to worry about it anymore. At that moment, the man's wife comes running into the room, completely terrified, asking what happened. The woman approaches the bed, relieved to see her husband safe, while the guy from Ilwoon just watches the scene from a distance. Our protagonist reflects that the patient almost perished because of a ridiculous mistake by a colleague. Suddenly, the gentleman thanks the guy from Ilwoon, leaving him completely surprised. The old man continues, saying he really thought he was a goner because he couldn't breathe, but he feels much better now that a real doctor took care of him. Our protagonist and Yeo Bong-cheol are silent, completely awkward about the situation. At that moment, a doctor arrives and calls for Yeo Bong-cheol, who turns to greet him. The man is Ma Dong-seep, the resident from thoracic surgery who came to help with the case. He praises Yeo Bong-cheol's good work and says that the surgery team will take over from there, and the other doctor agrees. With the situation under control, Yeo Bong-cheol turns his back to the interns and calls them with a serious voice. With an expression of pure rage, he tells everyone to follow him for a talk. The group of interns is completely terrified of the scolding that is to come. In a separate room, room, Yeo Bong-chil stares at them in silence, further increasing the tension in the air. With his arms crossed and a murderous aura, the resident prepares for his lecture. All the interns look down, completely ashamed and afraid of their superior's reaction. With an expression of pure disgust, Yeo Bong-chil says that this is the first time he has seen such a stupid mistake in the ER. He then explodes with anger and shouts, asking how they dare call themselves Youngguk interns and still mix up left and right on an X-ray, cursing all of them. Our protagonist thinks that, although the culprit is clearly Jo Jin, guy, in a situation like this, it was better to keep quiet, as anything said would sound like an excuse. Yeo Bong-chil continues his scolding, explaining that the other lung was already full of fluid and barely working, and they still punctured the only good one without even checking the X-ray. The resident shouts that they are trying to kill the patient and calls them murderers instead of doctors, leaving the group of interns completely terrified. He continues, saying that besides feeling sorry for the patient, they should be ashamed to face the thoracic surgery team after such a shameful mistake. After alongside, the doctor turns and calls directly for Jo Jin, guy by name. The young man responds terrified, stammering a high yes. As a superior approaches him, Yeo Bong-chil warns him not to get a big head just because his caste as often demotes him to only handling consent forms. As before, completely defeated, the useless intern agrees to the order with his head down. Soon after, the resident dismisses the group but asks Shin Sonhan to stay behind. Surprising our protagonist, the guy from the defunct university doesn't understand why he was asked to stay. Alone in the room, Yeo Bong-chil turns to him and says he needs to ask him a question. The doctor gets straight to the point and questions why the intern performed the needle aspiration procedure without consulting anyone. Young Xianhan is completely speechless, not knowing how to answer that difficult question. The resident warns him to think very carefully, as depending on his answer, his evaluation for the month could change completely. Under pressure, our protagonist swallows hard, knowing that the future of his career at that hospital is on the line.